Hello everyone. Tonight, we're looking at a part of history that you don't often find in books, but it was a very real part of life in quiet, hidden places, lust, sex, and sin in the Middle Ages. And before we begin, just a heads up, you probably wouldn't have survived back then. It's not because the topic is too spicy. Well, maybe it is. It's because if you had lived in medieval times with a curious mind and normal human desires, you likely would have been punished in some terrible way, like being whipped or burned, or all three, depending on the week. So, before you settle in, please take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you really like the content I make. Also, I would love to know, what city are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Now, lower the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a gentle sound, and let's begin our journey tonight. We start our journey tonight, not in a busy town or a lively pub, but in a monastery. Yes, not exactly the place you'd expect to find a lot of sin. The air smells like candles, wet stone, and something a bit like medicine. It's quiet, very, very quiet. The kind of quiet where every cough sounds like thunder. But even here, hidden behind thick monastery walls and religious promises, desire still burns like a flame that won't go out. The monks around you wear wool robes, and their hair is shaved in a circle, which is called a tonsure. They are supposed to have given up worldly pleasures. Lust is the enemy here, a dangerous beast. And yet, you notice how Brother Thomas tries too hard to avoid looking at Sister Agnes during the church service. His fingers move nervously when she walks by, and she holds her rosary beads tighter than she really needs to. You quickly realize this isn't just a single incident. Monasteries in the Middle Ages were a real struggle for the body. Monks and nuns fought constant, tiring battles with their own thoughts. Sex was the ultimate spiritual enemy, especially because you couldn't just get rid of it by fasting or taking cold baths. There were confessions full of embarrassing accidents, dreams that left clothes stained, and private moments with statues of saints that would be seen very differently today. One of the strangest things you find out is that monks kept records, detailed and uncomfortably honest ones. There's a story of a 12th century leader of a monastery who confessed that the devil would show him images of naked women in church. Yes, in church, during prayer. And did these images tempt him? Oh, definitely. He once said he was in so much pain that he slammed his face into the cold floor to calm down. It didn't work, by the way. In fact, some monasteries became famous for their not-so-holy actions. There's a story from 11th century France, where the entire male and female groups of a double monastery were found in, let's just say, a complicated situation, and not in a symbolic way. The church responded by closing it down and calling the whole place a secret brothel. What makes this even funnier is that life in a monastery was advertised as the best way to escape sin. Want to run from the temptations of the body? Easy. Make religious vows, eat plain food, chant in Latin, shave your head. But surprise, it didn't work. If anything, being alone made things worse. Think about it. Zero distractions, long hours alone with your thoughts, and the pressure to be pure hanging over you like a blade. That's basically a recipe for intense feelings. And don't think the women were any different. Nuns also wrote about their struggles, sometimes in code, and sometimes not. One 14th century nun described her nightmares of being tempted by black creatures with hot breath. This is classic imagery of a demon called an incubus. She wrote whole prayers asking God to make her soul stronger so she wouldn't. Well, you can imagine. There's even a debate among historians about whether these supernatural stories were symbolic or a real way for them to deal with desires they couldn't handle otherwise. Some experts think that calling it a demon was safer than saying, I have strong desires, and I hate it. Now, let's take a quick look at the stranger side of the monastery. Did you know some monks trained themselves to control their dreams just so they could avoid lustful images while they slept? It was like a form of dream yoga, but the medieval Catholic version, full of guilt. One little-known monk named Henrik claimed he could recite holy songs in his dreams to block out any tempting thoughts. Was it true? Who knows? But the fact that they even tried shows how desperate they were. And then there's the big secret in the monastery: actual affairs. Despite all the rules, many monks and nuns had secret relationships. They smuggled letters, had secret nighttime visits, and used hidden tunnels. A few were even discovered with children. That's right, children. In some convents, pregnant nuns were quietly sent away to ask for forgiveness, and the child either ended up abandoned or was mysteriously adopted by local villagers. The official story was a miraculous birth or a trick by the devil. Sure, still, not all monks were sad stories of failure. Some were truly dedicated to controlling their desires, and a few succeeded. There were saints who supposedly never had a single sexual thought, and others who claimed to have reached total purity. But here's the debate: did they really? Or were they just very good at hiding it or changing what pure meant in their diaries? Either way, your time in the monastery leaves you with a strange feeling of both awe at their intense struggle and sympathy for the fact that these people were told that even thinking about sex was a sin leading to damnation. That's a heavy weight to carry, especially when, let's be honest, people will be people. Even in 1142, you leave through a side door as the evening prayers begin, the chanting rising behind you like smoke. Outside, the moon is low, and a night bird calls from somewhere nearby. You are heading deeper into this medieval world now, where the line between holy and horny keeps getting more blurry. And next up, we have saints with visions that would definitely make you look twice. You don't get far from the monastery before you find yourself in another story. Saints, those perfect examples of holiness, weren't exactly immune to lust either. In fact, the more you look into their lives, the more you realize many of them spent years in what can only be called very personal, and sometimes erotic, battles with the devil, and sometimes with God. You put yourself in the shoes of a medieval believer, feeling both doubtful and amazed as you read about the lives of saints. The church called these stories vita. These weren't just boring moral lessons. Oh no, these stories had plot twists, temptations, naked ghosts, physical pain, and a spiritual joy that got confusingly close to the other kind of joy. Take Saint Anthony the Great, for example. The poor man ran away to the desert to escape temptation, and ended up facing even more of it. According to his life stories, demons sent him visions of women throwing themselves at him. Their bodies shined, their eyes sparkled, and in a classic move, Anthony rolled around in a thorny bush to stop his impure thoughts. Not as a metaphor, he actually jumped into it. You're not sure if that worked, but you have to admire his dedication. But it's not just men. The female saints get even stranger. Meet Saint Catherine of Siena. She took a vow to remain a virgin at age 7. As an adult, she claimed she was spiritually married to Christ, and even received a ring that, according to her, was made from the foreskin of Jesus. Yep, you blink, read it again, and there it is. Foreskin. Medieval stories about saints had no limits. And then there's Saint Teresa of Avila. Although she lived a bit after the medieval period, her writings show centuries of mystical, erotic feelings. She wrote about an angel piercing her heart with a flaming spear, which made her twist in pain and joy so strong it left her completely overwhelmed. If that sounds a bit like a scene from a romance novel involving divine BDSM, you're not the only one. Scholars still debate whether these visions were purely spiritual or if Teresa was expressing suppressed desires using spiritual words. Some even argue she was having out-of-body orgasmic experiences and just didn't have the words for it. They were popular, widely read, and even used as teaching material for other religious people. The message was clear. To be spiritually perfect, you had to face lust head-on. And how did you defeat it? Well, often by suffering through increasingly strange, and sometimes sexy, torments. But here's the twist that makes you curious. Sometimes the saints enjoyed the visions. There are parts where the feeling changes from scary to amazing, from disgust to wonder. A 13th century mystic named Saint Lutgardus claimed that Christ kissed her on the mouth in a romantic way. She felt filled with warmth and heard heavenly music. Was it a symbol? Maybe. Was it also the only way a woman in that society could talk about any kind of strong pleasure? Almost certainly. That's where the real debate begins. Were these saints truly rising above their bodies? Or were they just finding clever ways around the rules? Like a spiritual performance, where they played a role society allowed and used it to say what they couldn't say out loud. Even stranger, some of these visions were like common romantic stories of the time. The fainting, the being out of breath, the feeling of being overpowered and helpless. The words used for religious joy started to sound like love poems, and love poems started to sound like religious joy. And honestly, after a few hours of reading these saintly stories, you start to get them mixed up with love scenes from romance tales. One moment you're reading about a nun's dream of being surrounded by divine light. The next, she's describing a sweetness that's not like any earthly touch. You start to think these women had very active imaginations and very few ways to express them. Meanwhile, the church was in a tricky position. On one hand, these mystical experiences were signs of God's favor. On the other hand, if a vision got too steamy, it wasn't long before they were suspected of heresy, madness, or even being possessed by a demon. Many mystics, especially women, had to walk that dangerous line. If you were too holy, you might be called a living saint. If you were too sensual about it, you might end up on trial. You slip into a small chapel to catch your breath. Inside, there's a painting of Saint Margaret holding a dragon by its tail, and honestly, it's not the most innocent picture. Everything in this time had a double meaning. That's what's so interesting. No one could talk openly about sex, but everyone knew what they were hinting at. Saints, poets, even the bishops played this secret game of codes. And of course, not every saint got through it without problems. Saint Christina, the Astonishing, and her name isn't even the weirdest part about her, was said to float, throw herself into fires, and jump into icy rivers to fight temptation. Her whole life story reads like a medieval fever dream. Some people think she had epilepsy or a nerve condition, and her visions were misunderstood. Others see her as a true mystic, trying to deal with the clash between body and soul in a world that punished both. You leave the chapel just as a bell rings in the distance. It's another reminder of how closely time and rules were tied to desire. In this world, these weren't just stories for religious people. They were guides for survival, warnings, fantasies, and if we're being honest, slightly erotic fan fiction for people who couldn't read the Canterbury Tales without blushing. By the time you're on the road again, the saints feel less like perfect idols and more like tired humans trying to understand overwhelming feelings. It's comforting in a strange way. Even the most holy people couldn't escape the pull of desire. They just found more creative and poetic ways to struggle with it. And speaking of poetic struggles, you're now heading to the courts of love, where knights long for ladies, ladies make plans, and nobody is really as noble as the songs claim. You arrive at a large castle just as the sun starts to set behind the towers. It covers the stones in a warm, golden light. Inside, a big meal is being prepared. Roasted meats, spiced wine, and fruit piled high. You can already hear the sound of lutes and the low hum of poetry being read in sad tones. Welcome to the world of courtly love, where desire is celebrated. Flirting is an art, and yet absolutely no one seems to be having sex. You sit down in the great hall and watch the people playing this strange game. Over there, a knight is kneeling before a noblewoman. His eyes are intense, and his voice is shaking as he promises to be loyal forever. He praises her eyes, her grace, the way she walks across the floor like a swan on a lake, and so on. She, in turn, accepts his devotion with just the right amount of coolness. A raised eyebrow, a smile that could be seen as kind or mean. They exchange small gifts, a glove, a scarf, sometimes even a lock of hair. But if he thinks that gets him anywhere near her bedroom, he's wrong. This is courtly love, refined, painful, and as you quickly realize, probably invented by someone who enjoyed emotional suffering. It's not about getting what you want. It's about the longing, the perfect idea, the love that cannot and should not be fulfilled. That's what makes it pure. You start to wonder if this whole cultural obsession was the medieval version of edging. The poets of the time, called troubadours, specialized in this kind of thing. They would travel from court to court, singing about women they could never have and the pain of loving someone they could never touch. One of the most famous was Chrétien de Troyes, who gave us stories of Lancelot and Guinevere and other classic situations where true love is always just out of reach, or has to be kept secret because someone is already married to a king or an enemy lord. And yes, while these stories were fiction, they influenced how the nobility actually behaved. People copied what they read. Ladies would flirt just enough to get devotion, but not so much that they lost control. Knights would do crazy things, like jousting, killing beasts, and writing poems by candlelight. You start to think maybe the real prize was the performance itself. The idea that wanting something was more noble than having it. But here's the catch. That's all just on the surface. If you look a little deeper, you'll find that these pure declarations were often just a cover for very real affairs, especially at court, where political marriages were normal. Love often had to be found somewhere else. You follow a few couples into side hallways and watch their masks fall off the moment they are alone. The longing turns into touching, the poetry turns into whispers, and the noble self-control becomes an excuse to sneak off behind a tapestry. One really interesting example is Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court of love. She was one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, and she basically held gatherings where ladies discussed the rules of romantic behavior. Like a medieval episode of The Bachelor. Should a man go after a married woman? Should jealousy be encouraged? How do you test a lover's loyalty? It all sounds very polite and philosophical until you realize that many of the people there were having affairs of their own, often with the very knights who were writing those swooning poems. Still, this whole courtly love thing had strict rules. A big one was that it was supposed to be non-physical. That kept it from being technically a sin. The church didn't like it, of course. It seemed too focused on worldly desires instead of divine love. But it was hard to blame someone for saying they admired someone else's soul, especially when it came with such beautiful metaphors. But the lines were always blurry. You find a story about a nobleman who cut himself with a dagger to prove his devotion to a lady who rejected him. She was moved by his action and agreed to a secret meeting. You'd think that's where things finally got physical. But no, they just talked. She told him he had won her heart, and he promised to serve her until he died. That was it. Everyone left disappointed, including you, and yet these relationships were very important. A single flirtation could destroy reputations, ruin marriages, and even start wars. Kings got jealous, queens got clever, and knights switched sides. You watch it all happen in slow motion. The way a look becomes a rumor, and a rumor becomes a scandal. A lady of the court walks by you and whispers, "It's not the love that's dangerous, it's the politics." She's not wrong. There's also a fringe theory you come across. Some scholars believe that courtly love was actually a kind of literary smokescreen for real-world power negotiations. Noble women, who were often used as pawns in arranged marriages, used the rituals of courtly love to gain influence by choosing who to favor, who to tease, and who to shame in front of others. They subtly controlled the social situation. So maybe that glove wasn't just a gift, it was a move in a game of chess. And then there's the sex, or lack of it. Some historians argue that courtly love was a kind of early erotic performance, a way to channel desire into something socially acceptable. Others insist that there was sex, but it was just hidden behind metaphors and poetic language thick enough to confuse any chaperones. After all, medieval texts rarely said things directly. Instead of, "they slept together," it was, "he took shelter in her garden," very subtle. By the end of the evening, you realize you've been watching a fancy costume party, where everyone is pretending to be above physical desires while quietly trying to get access to them. Lust here wears a mask of longing. It's planned, controlled, and still somehow manages to burn through the silk lace and fluttering fans like a wildfire. You step outside the hall. The night is cool and smells of rose petals and wine. Somewhere behind you, a poet is still reading to a duchess who is only half interested. But you're headed somewhere different now. You've seen how the nobles pretend. It's time to see how the peasants really live, and how they manage without privacy, power, or poems. You leave the shiny world of nobles behind. No more velvet curtains, or lute music. No more flirty fan dances. Now the air is heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and farm animals. You're standing in the middle of a medieval village, somewhere in northern Europe, maybe England or France. The houses are small and packed together, made of wood and straw. And there's no such thing as personal space, let alone privacy. But that doesn't mean people here don't fall in love or lust, or end up tangled in bedrolls on cold nights. In fact, they often do. But without the fancy silk sheets or carefully written poetry. You peek into one of the small houses, ducking under the low doorway. The inside is a single room with one bed, maybe two if they're lucky. Parents, kids, and sometimes even a goat all sleep within a few feet of each other. And here's where things get clever. There's a tradition in some areas called bundling or bed courtship, where a young couple, often teenagers, is allowed to lie together in bed with their clothes on to talk, get to know each other, and see if they're a good match. Yes, you heard that right. In bed together, usually with a wooden plank or a cloth bag between them, but still more modern than you'd expect. Of course, the idea was that they wouldn't have sex, that they'd just, hang out. Supervised closeness. But let's be honest. They were teenagers, they were curious, and they were surrounded by hay. You do the math. And sometimes this led to what was nicely called premarital negotiation. If a girl got pregnant, the community often expected the young man to marry her. Forced weddings weren't rare, and neither was the quiet acceptance that, hey, maybe the bundling bag was more for show than for stopping anything. What surprises you is how much the community is involved in all this. In a society where privacy is almost non-existent, the community becomes both a witness and a judge of romantic relationships. Neighbors gossip, families watch closely, and a person's public reputation can make or break a relationship. You hear about a ritual where village women would check the bedsheets after a wedding night to confirm the marriage had been consummated. If the sheet was bloody, everything was fine. If not, rumors would spread. You wonder how many smart brides stained the fabric beforehand just to avoid a scandal. Sex among the peasants isn't hidden behind the same act of purity as it is among the nobility. It's a part of life, practical, sometimes gentle, sometimes quick. You watch couples steal moments behind haystacks or in the forest, where the sound of birds and rustling leaves gives them a little bit of cover. A few get caught, sure, but the punishment is often lighter than you'd think. A small fine, maybe some public apology. Everyone knows that desire doesn't wait for the church's permission. That said, there were rules, and crossing certain lines could be dangerous. Adultery, especially if it involved someone of a higher social class, could lead to being kicked out, whipped, or worse. But among the lower classes, sexual mistakes were often dealt with inside the community. You see a strange custom called a chivalry, where a man who married a much younger woman, or someone thought to be unfaithful, is paraded through the village on a donkey, while people bang pots and yell insults. It's half punishment, half performance. And it feels like petty revenge dressed up as moral anger. Still, there's humor here too, a kind of down-to-earth acceptance. One local midwife, a strong woman with a gap-toothed smile, pulls you aside and says, "The Lord can keep his sermons. Babies come when they want." She's helped with dozens of births, some from married couples, some not, and she doesn't seem particularly shocked by any of it. She even jokes about how many noblemen have left their blessings in village cradles. And yes, that's a thing. Noblemen would sometimes use their power to take advantage of peasant girls, leading to children of mixed status, who were often quietly accepted into the village, or not so quietly, cast out. One thing that stands out is how marriage itself isn't always a big deal here. Sometimes it's just a handshake in front of witnesses, a spoken agreement that they'll share work, food, and a bed. The church wants a priest to be involved, of course, but in many cases, local customs are what matter. If you live together, and if everyone sees you as a couple, then that's that. It's marriage by public agreement, and it's surprisingly flexible, until it eyes and single quotes. But, of course, there's always someone watching from the sidelines. You meet an old widow who whispers about the woods, women, young girls who disappeared into the forest to avoid shame after a pregnancy, or who practiced their own kind of folk magic to control their fertility. There are herbs passed in secret. Some of it is practical, some of it is superstition. All of it shows how hard women tried to keep control in a world that often denied them any say. And this is where you find the quirky fact of the night. In some parts of medieval Europe, young couples would carve love runes into the bark of trees. It wasn't just a romantic gesture, but a kind of spiritual insurance. If they couldn't afford a priest's blessing, the tree would do. It was natural, eternal, and honestly more available than a bishop. You pass one such tree, with hearts carved into the bark and initials that are hard to read. And you wonder how many generations of secret love stories it has seen. Scholars still argue about how common sex before marriage was among peasants. Some point to church records full of fines and punishments. Others say those records only show the rare cases that caused a scandal. What's clear is that the rules on paper and the reality in the fields rarely matched. Desire finds a way. It grows in the shadows, and in medieval villages, it shaped lives in ways that were more honest and sometimes more humane than all the noble poetry in the world. You leave the village behind, your boots muddy, your mind full of images of flickering fires, whispered promises, and stolen kisses behind barn doors. The peasants may not have had silks or ballads, but they had passion, risk, and moments of tenderness carved into the bark of trees. Next, you're heading back to the convents, but this time, the women are in charge. Nuns with ink-stained fingers, and some, surprisingly, spicy secrets. You step through a creaking wooden gate into the walled quiet of a convent, half expecting to be met with angelic singing and the smell of incense. Instead, you're greeted by the sharp smell of vinegar and a surprising scent of roasted onions coming from the kitchen garden. The air is clean but filled with unspoken stories. Nuns move across the courtyard with practiced grace, their habits flapping in the wind, their eyes lowered, and their hands folded. Yet, behind this calm, there's a pulse. Something lively and human beats beneath the linen and Latin. You can almost feel it inside the convent walls. It's supposed to be a safe place from sin, a shelter from temptation, and a place where women give themselves completely to God. And sure, on the surface, everything follows the rules. There are prayers, chants, hours of silence, and manuscripts, copied with almost obsessive care. But soon you realize this place is much more than a retreat from the body. It's a community of women thinking, feeling, dreaming, and yes, sometimes fantasizing, just like everyone else in medieval society. And they kept records. You find yourself in the convent library, where the air smells of old paper and beeswax. One of the sisters, older and quietly entertained by your curiosity, unlocks a cabinet and shows you something few outsiders ever see: the private writings of nuns. Not religious rules, not holy books, not dry theological discussions. No, what she shows you are diaries, delicate collections of longing, shame, visions, and desire, written between prayers and poems. Some of it is spiritual, yes, but not always in the way you'd expect. One entry you read describes a dream where the writer sees the Virgin Mary holding her with a tenderness that sounds less like a mother's comfort and more like an overwhelming wave of joy. Another tells of being kissed on the mouth by an angel again and again until she wakes up gasping, convinced she's either blessed or damned. You're not sure which one she wants more. One nun writes about a fellow sister's golden hair, describing it as like summer wheat, and the gentle weight of her hand during prayer. It reads like a quiet, intimate, almost sad longing. It never says anything directly, but the feeling is clear. And it turns out this wasn't a rare case. In convents across Europe, from England to Italy, scholars have found letters and poems passed between women, sometimes in code, sometimes shockingly direct. One nun in Germany wrote of her hunger for the warmth of Sister Clara's body. Another, in a small outpost in France, confessed that she asked for God's mercy for dreaming of carnal joy while sharing a bed in winter. You pause here. Wait, sharing a bed? Oh yes, convent dormitories were shared, often with 2 or more nuns, per straw mattress in colder seasons. It was practical, it saved money, and in some cases, it was an unexpected opportunity for closeness. While rules banned physical affection, they weren't always enforced. After all, There were no cameras or DNA tests, just a lot of dim candlelight, heavy robes, and human need. Still, not everything was hidden. In fact, some leaders of convents, called abbesses, kept surprisingly honest records of bad behavior. You find one case where a nun was caught with a visiting monk under a staircase, of all places. Another was discovered with a local butcher's daughter who had been snuck into the convent dressed as a laundry helper. In most cases, the punishment was being alone for a while, saying extra prayers, and getting a serious talk. But sometimes, especially if noble families were involved, scandals were completely covered up. And then there were the love gifts, small crosses, carved charms, and notes tucked into rosary bags. One nun buried a letter under the roots of a cherry tree, addressed, "To the one whose voice haunts me in sleep." She never signed it. She didn't have to. Everyone in the convent knew. But it wasn't always about sex or forbidden love. Many of these women were incredibly smart and hungry for knowledge. They read everything, Augustine, Plato, even Roman poets, if they could get away with it. They debated theology late into the night, translated texts, and wrote mystical thoughts that, when you look at them closely, sound like erotic poetry disguised in religious language. One visionary nun describes her soul being pierced by a divine flame and opened like a flower to the light. If that's not a metaphor for foreplay, you don't know what is. Now, here's your fringe fact for the night. Hildegard of Bingen, the famous 12th century abbess, composer, and mystic, once wrote that a woman's soul could become pregnant with divine inspiration, an idea that some modern readers see as a form of spiritual queerness. She also had a very intense, possibly romantic, relationship with another nun named Richardess. This ended in a flood of heartbroken letters when Richardess was moved to another convent. Hildegard's sadness reads like a breakup album in Latin. Of course, modern scholars debate what all of this means. Were these relationships romantic, platonic, or just emotional ways of coping in an all-female environment? Did nuns understand their own desires in the same way we think about sexuality today? There's no single answer. What's clear is that these women lived full, complex, emotional lives, far from the image of passive, celibate angels that church propaganda liked to show. You also learn that many women didn't choose to be in a convent. Families often sent their daughters here as a financial or political move. If you weren't beautiful enough to marry well, or if you had too many older sisters, you were sent to the nunnery. Some accepted it, others didn't. One diary has a single, heartbreaking line: "I do not love my vows, but I obey them." It hits harder than any sermon. And let's not forget the occasional rebels. The nuns who snuck out of the convent at night, visited taverns, and even took lovers. In 14th century Italy, one group of nuns was discovered hosting masked dances in their convent, complete with hired musicians. When church officials arrived, they found wine, laughter, and a suspicious lack of guilt. The women were disciplined, of course, but not kicked out. Why? Because some of them were related to bishops. Surprise! As you walk back through the convent, with moonlight falling through arched windows, you hear the echo of a hymn coming from the chapel. It's beautiful and haunting, but under the melody is the undeniable truth that these women, so often seen as perfect examples of virtue, were just as full of longing, conflict, imagination, and secrets as anyone else. Maybe even more so, hidden away from the world with only candlelight and each other for company. Next, you'll slide into a confession booth where the air is thick with incense and whispered sin. And on the other side of the screen is a priest who might be more familiar with temptation than you'd think. You step into the shadowy quiet of a stone church, where stained glass throws scattered pools of colored light across worn benches, and the smell of centuries-old incense sticks to everything. The altar shines in the distance, but your attention is drawn to a much darker corner, the confessional booth. It's a strange little wooden box, like a closet for secrets, with memories soaked into its wood. You slip inside, close the curtain, and find yourself breathing the same dusty air as generations of sinners who have kneeled here before you. On the other side of the screen, a priest clears his throat. And what happens next isn't exactly what you'd expect, in theory. The medieval confessional is a sacred space, a way to clean the soul, a ritual for revealing your most shameful desires to God. But in practice, well, that's where things get complicated. Because the person behind the screen isn't just a holy man. He's human, with ears and curiosity. And let's be honest, sometimes he has questionable self-control. Confessions could be brutally detailed. People came to priests not just to ask for forgiveness, but also to ask if the specific thing they did with their spouse, their neighbor, or a traveling musician technically counted as a sin. You hear one such confession. A young man is trembling as he whispers that he let a girl touch his shameful member while they were bathing. The priest doesn't respond with anger, but with a series of detailed questions, some of which sound less like spiritual advice and more like personal research. That's not entirely surprising. Priests were often the most educated men in the village, but that didn't make them immune to lust. In fact, some had more access to temptation than most. Parish priests were supposed to be celibate, a rule set by the church in the 12th century, but it wasn't always followed. And rural communities didn't have bishops watching them all the time. So, when the local priest took a mistress, everyone kind of looked the other way, unless he became too obvious about it. You come across the story of Father Gerard, who was known for hearing certain women's confessions in private, and for taking a suspiciously long time to do so. One widow confessed to him every week, always after dark, and neighbors reported seeing candlelight in his window late into the night. Eventually, a bishop investigated, and Gerard was quietly moved to a monastery up north. No trial, no punishment, just a new location, and probably a whole new group of souls to guide. But even the well-meaning priests could behave strangely. One particularly religious friar, Brother Luca, kept a book where he counted how many times his parishioners confessed sins of the flesh, not their names, just the type of sin and how often it happened. The data he collected is bizarre, he noted. Trends like more self-pollution, confessions on Mondays, and that married women reported impure dreams more often than unmarried girls. Whether it was a spiritual survey or an obsession with other people's private lives, it's hard to say. And here's a particularly odd little fact you discover. Some priests gave very specific punishments for sexual sins. Not just, say, 5 Hail Marys, but things like walk barefoot to the chapel 3 times while reciting Psalm 51, or fast for 40 days and sleep only on stones. In one shocking case, a man who admitted to having sex with an animal was told to carry a candle larger than himself through town during Mass. Yes, really, the public shame was the point. But whether it stopped others is questionable. And it wasn't just the regular people sharing secrets. Priests themselves sometimes confessed to each other in secret, or to their superiors when their guilt became too much. There are records of priests admitting to sleeping with nuns, with widows, and even with their own housekeepers. Some showed real regret. Others made excuses, like she was lonely, or I thought we were married in God's eyes. One particularly bold priest simply wrote, "The flesh was stronger than the soul." I regret little, of course. Not all priests were wild men in robes. Many took their vows seriously, struggled with their desires, and confessed their own thoughts with great pain. But even they weren't safe from suspicion. A priest who was too handsome, too gentle, or too friendly with women might be accused of inappropriate behavior, whether he ever did anything wrong or not. In a world where sex and sin were tangled together, even a warm smile could become a scandal waiting to happen. You also hear about female confessors. There weren't many, but they existed in certain religious groups, and the difference is clear. They were often stricter, more professional, and less easily shocked. Some women, in fact, preferred confessing to another woman, especially when the sin was about the body. Imagine trying to tell a red-faced young priest about a sensual dream involving Saint Sebastian. Now, imagine telling someone who's had a few of those dreams herself. Still, confession was often less about forgiveness and more about control. The church gained immense power by holding everyone's secrets. They knew who slept where, who loved whom, and who wanted what. They used that information to keep moral order, sure, but also to have influence. A noble who confessed to adultery might be advised to donate a new chapel. A baker who visited a brothel too often might mysteriously lose his market stall. Guilt became a form of currency, and here's where the scholarly debate gets interesting. Some historians argue that the confessional booth was less a place for spiritual healing and more a tool for psychological spying, an early form of control that kept people obsessed with their own moral mistakes. Others insist it gave people relief, a place to talk about things they had no other way to talk about. The truth, as always, is probably a mix of both. Confession was at the same time a therapy session, a trap, a relief, and a risk. You finally leave the booth, the carved wood creaking behind you. Outside, the sun is getting low, and the sound of bells rolls across the town like a warning. You've heard so many sins whispered into the dark, and not all of them stayed hidden. Some turned into gossip, some grew into scandal, and some shaped the way entire communities saw themselves. As you cross the courtyard, you realize that in this world, sin wasn't just an action. It was a story, a confession waiting to be told, a burden begging to be passed to someone else. And up next, you'll be standing in the town square, where private pleasure becomes a very public show. The square is already buzzing by the time you arrive. It has the kind of low, excited hum that comes before a storm, or in this case, a public shaming. You push your way through the crowd of villagers, cloaked merchants, and old women with baskets. At their feet, everyone's eyes are on a wooden platform in the center, where a pair of stocks has been cleaned and oiled. Next to it is a barrel filled with rotten vegetables. Welcome to medieval justice, where sin doesn't just trouble your soul, it gets a full, painfully public performance. Today's unlucky star is a woman in her 30s, with wild hair and a red face. You suspect it's not from embarrassment, but from pure anger. She's been accused of adultery, though the details are unclear. The man involved isn't here, he never is. She, on the other hand, is about to spend the afternoon in the stocks, with her ankles and wrists locked in place, while the townspeople do what they do best: judge, mock, and throw things. You feel it instantly. This isn't about justice, it's theater. The whole town has come out not just to punish sin, but to enjoy it. Children laugh as they get ready to throw mushy turnips. A drunk shoemaker yells something about loose women before nearly falling into a pig pen. But it's not all fun and games. There's a strong feeling of cruelty here, too. The crowd loves to watch someone fall, especially a woman who dared to want something she wasn't supposed to. Public punishment for sexual mistakes was surprisingly common in medieval towns. Adultery, having sex before marriage, and even lewd speech could land you in the pillory. or worse. Sometimes it was just a fine or a public whipping. Other times it was being exiled, having your head shaved, or getting a brand burned into your skin. The punishments were different depending on the region, social status, and gender, but the message was always the same. Lust is dangerous, and if you act on it, you better be ready to pay the price. You learn that married women received the worst of these punishments. If a wife was unfaithful, even just emotionally, it was seen as a betrayal not just of her husband, but of the social order. A man, on the other hand, could often get away with an affair, especially if he claimed the woman tempted him. You see, this double standard in the records. Men caught with prostitutes were sometimes fined. Women labeled as prostitutes could be whipped, branded, or forced to wear embarrassing clothes. In one town, they had to wear striped hoods whenever they were in public, like a scarlet letter sewn onto their clothes. And the punishments weren't just for actual sex. You find a set of court records describing the public humiliation of a man accused of secretly dressing. His crime was wearing his wife's dress while cleaning the house and supposedly dancing alone. No sexual contact, no victim, but he was dragged into the town square and forced to wear women's clothes in front of everyone while being hit with sheepdung. It wasn't about morality. It was about enforcing rules, making sure you stay in your place, and being what your body told them you should be. Then there's the case of the Baud, a woman who ran an unofficial brothel out of her cellar. When she was caught, she wasn't executed or put in prison. Instead, she was paraded through the town in a cart, holding a sign that read, "Mother of Whores." The church loved this kind of punishment. It didn't just shame, it warned her neighbors. Friends, and maybe even former clients, watched in silence as she passed, their faces carefully blank. No one wanted to be next. Still, not all public punishments were for the big, scandalous sins. Sometimes you'd get dragged into the square for simply being too loud in your flirting, or too bold with your jokes. One woman in Norwich was put in the pillory for calling a merchant's apprentice ripe fruit in the market. Her real crime was doing it in front of the wrong priest's wife. There was a fine line between flirting and breaking the rules, and sometimes it just depended on who was listening. And here's your quirky, almost unbelievable detail for the night. In parts of medieval France, married couples caught fighting about infidelity were forced to literally kiss and make up in public. They'd be led to the market square, sometimes in chains, and forced to kneel before each other, confess their mistakes, and kiss. If they refused, they faced heavier punishments. Imagine being forced to apologize with garlic on your breath and half the town watching. Welcome to Romance, Medieval Edition. There's a debate among scholars about whether these public punishments actually stopped sin or just gave communities a way to let off steam, reinforce their rules, and shame those who didn't follow them. Some historians argue that the public nature of these events made them like rituals, almost theatrical, and that the real purpose wasn't justice, but unity. If everyone booed the same person, they'd feel better about their own hidden sins. Others believe these shows were more about power, about reminding people who made the rules and who could break them. Back in the square, the woman in the stocks has gone quiet. Her eyes are fixed on a distant point beyond the mocking crowd. The vegetables have stopped flying. People are losing interest. Someone starts playing a flute. The moment has passed. Tomorrow, someone else will be in her place. A drunk, a thief, maybe another lover who made the wrong move at the wrong time. You step away from the square, your boots crunching on cabbage leaves and broken shame. The sun is low now, casting long shadows. It's strange how easily pleasure turns into punishment here. How the things people want become the weapons used against them. And yet, despite the risk, they still keep wanting. Next, you'll head into darker places where lust isn't just punished, but turned into something evil. A woman is about to stand trial for having relations with something from hell. You might want to keep your crucifix handy. You arrive at the edge of a village, just as the torches are being lit. Their flames cast sharp shadows on the wooden houses. The air is heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. But there's something else underneath it. Something sharper. Fear. It moves like a fog through the streets, getting thicker near the church where a crowd has gathered. They're not here for prayer. They're here for a trial. And not just any trial. This is the kind where accusations burn hotter than facts, and demons are given names. A woman is being accused of sleeping with the devil himself. Her name is Isabeau. She's in her mid-30s, a widow, an herbalist, and a mother of 2. And unfortunately for her, she's also attractive, independent, and rumored to know which plants can bring on a woman's period or calm down a restless husband. These days, that's enough to get you called a witch. But when you squeeze through the crowd and see her hands tied, dress torn at the sleeve, eyes burning with anger, you can tell this is about more than just herbs or local gossip. Someone has accused her of having sex with a demon, and everyone seems a little too ready to believe it. The priest, full of self-importance and beard oil, reads the charges out loud in a voice that shakes just enough to sound dramatic. She did have relations with a demon in the form of a man. She did allow the creature to enter her body through unholy ways. She did cry out in pleasure rather than pain. The crowd shifts. Murmurs spread. Some people cross themselves. Others look a little too curious. You find yourself leaning in to Ian. Not because you're a voyeur, okay? Maybe a little. But because you know how these stories go. Isabeau won't just be asked about her soul. They'll want details. What did the demon look like? Did it have claws or hooves? Did it speak in other languages or whisper sweet things in her ear? And yes, that's what they're asking right now. With a clerk writing it all down, what's wild is how detailed these demon sex stories often were. Inquisition records are full of women describing creatures that visited them at night. Sometimes handsome, sometimes monstrous. Some came as lovers, others as attackers. Some tempted with soft words and warm hands. Others forced themselves into dreams like a sickness. But no matter how the women described it, the church had a story ready. These were incubi male demons who tempted women into sin, stole their semen, and used it to create more evil. Conveniently, it explained everything, from sleep paralysis and sexual desire to why someone's sheets might be damp in the morning. You hear Isabeau's voice cut through the crowd, defiant and trembling. She says the devil came in the form of her dead husband, that she dreamed of him touching her, kissing her, and lying beside her just like he used to. That it felt real, and that she wanted it to be real. And just like that, the crowd changes again. Some feel sympathy, others feel horror, because she admitted the most dangerous thing of all, that she enjoyed it. The irony here is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The same church leaders who spoke out against desire also believed that. Demons spent all their time tempting people, especially women, especially at night, and especially in ways that just happened to match people's actual hidden fantasies. There's something darkly funny about that, or tragic, or both. And then comes the inspection. Yes, the physical kind. A midwife is brought forward to search Isabeau's body for a witch's mark, some mole, blemish, or patch of skin that doesn't feel pain. You watch as she's forced to strip under the torchlight, while strangers examine her for proof that she's been fed by a demon. It's invasive, humiliating, and worse, it's deadly serious, because if they find something, anything, it's over. They do, of course, a freckle on her inner thigh. That's all it takes. The priest declares it the devil's kiss, and just like that, the accusation becomes impossible to fight. But here's where the scholarly debates get heated. Did these women really believe they'd slept with demons? Were they describing vivid dreams seen through the filter of religious fear? Or were they inventing stories under torture? Or were these confessions shaped entirely by their questioners, with desperate women saying what they thought would stop the pain or match what they were told had to be true? Some historians argue that these were simply erotic dreams that were misunderstood by both the dreamer and society. Others suggest the church itself projected its own sexual panic onto the accused as a way to control not just sin, but also female independence. Because here's the thing, many of these so-called witches weren't seductresses or Satanists. They were healers, widows, midwives, herbalists, women who lived alone, knew too much, or refused to obey. Their real crime wasn't sleeping with demons, it was not fitting in. Lust became the easiest crime to accuse them of because it made the story juicy, attention-grabbing, and impossible to prove or disprove. And if she enjoyed it, that made her even more dangerous, because a woman who likes sex is apparently halfway to hell. You discover a chilling detail buried in an old court report. In some trials, women were asked to describe how the demon's semen felt inside them. The assumption was that it would be isolde proof, that it came from hell. If they said it was warm, or if they hesitated, it meant they were lying. How far the church went, using imaginary semen temperature as a tool for damnation. You don't know whether to laugh or scream as the torchlight flickers across the square. The verdict is announced. Guilty, Isabeau is sentenced to public penance and a whipping. She'll be marched through town barefoot in a simple dress, holding a candle taller than she is. If she survives that humiliation, she might be allowed to return to her home. Or she might disappear like so many others, burned quietly without any record. You step away as the crowd breaks up, stunned and chatty, already adding details to the story for tomorrow's gossip. A few whisper that Isabeau flew at night. Others claim she gave birth to a toad. The line between sex and sorcery is razor-thin here, and razor-sharp. Next, you'll take a closer look at the objects designed to stop all this sin before it starts. Devices of virtue, control, and maybe a touch of kink. Yes, it's time to talk about chastity belts. You're standing in a small room at the back of a fortress. The stone walls are damp, and the ceiling is low enough to make you duck. On a wooden table is the object of your curiosity, shining in a single beam of sunlight, like some kind of divine joke. A chastity belt. It's made of iron, lined with leather, and cold to the touch. It has a front plate that covers everything with a cruel kind of style, pierced with holes for hygiene, or so they say. It's locked at the hips with a key the size of a baby goat's hoof. Welcome to the awkward meeting point of lust, fear, and medieval engineering. The myth of the chastity belt is powerful. You've probably heard it in a dozen ways. Noble knights locking up their wives before going on a crusade. Women sealed into metal underwear to keep them pure. Keys worn around their husbands' necks like twisted wedding rings. It has all the elements of a dark fairy tale. But as you look closer, you start to notice something strange. This belt is a little too fancy, a little too perfect, almost like it was made to be looked at, not worn. And that's the first clue that things aren't as simple as they seem. Historians are still arguing about whether chastity belts were ever widely used, or used at all. Sure, there are museum displays, and the occasional drawing from the Renaissance that shows women strapped into these torture panties of shame. But the earliest physical belts we have are mostly from the 15th century or later, and some look suspiciously like 19th century fakes, designed to excite more than to scare. That's right. Some medieval chastity belts might be the historical version of cosplay props for Victorian gentlemen with very specific tastes. Still, the idea had its roots. The church was obsessed with controlling female sexuality, and chastity was practically a form of currency. Virginity wasn't just a moral state. It was a bargaining chip in marriage, a symbol of family honor, and a religious ideal. So the idea of literally locking it down fit right in with the wider culture of control. Whether or not women were walking around wearing iron thongs, the threat, the metaphor, and the obsession were very real. You look through some old manuscripts and find a few references, none of them very positive. One Italian text describes a jealous merchant who had a blacksmith make a belt to protect the virtue of his young wife. Another tells of a paranoid noble who required his daughters to be secured whenever they left the estate. No one says how long they wore them, how they bathed, or how infections were dealt with. You start to suspect those details were conveniently left out or completely made up. But there are weirder facts, too. Some belts were designed not just to prevent intercourse, but to prevent pleasure. One model has little spikes on the inside, like a reverse hedgehog. Another has a mechanism that makes walking normally almost impossible. Some researchers believe these were punishment devices, not preventative ones, used to discipline unruly women or sex workers in particularly cruel cities. Whether those were rare cases or part of a wider practice is still hotly debated. And it's not just women. You find a sketch of a male chastity device, an iron codpiece that looks like a meat grinder. Apparently, some men were forced to wear these during periods of penance or by their wives as revenge for infidelity. There's even one bizarre story, possibly made up, about a young monk who asked to be locked up by his abbot to keep his urges in check. Talk about commitment. Still, for all the physical evidence, or lack of it, the idea of the chastity belt was a big part of the medieval imagination. Poets wrote about it. Preachers warned of it. Satirists mocked it. One funny French ballad describes a woman outsmarting the belt by bribing a locksmith, then having a rendezvous with 3 different suitors before morning prayers. Another joke goes that a knight returns from the Holy Land to find his wife not only pregnant, but wearing the belt with the key still on his neck. The message: where there's a will, there's a workaround. You find a quirky little record from Nuremberg in the 1500s of a man who tried to sell a virtue device at a public market. The city council ordered him to be whipped, not because the device was immoral, but because the whole idea was considered a fraud and ridiculous. Apparently, even then, people were skeptical about the practicality of strapping someone into medieval Tupperware and expecting it to end well. Modern scholars often argue that the chastity belt became more symbolic than real, metaphor for control, a tool of propaganda, a warning. By the time the Renaissance came around, the image of the belt was being used in paintings and pamphlets more as a comment on jealousy, power, and hypocrisy than as an actual practice. In that sense, it's a cousin to the scold's bridle or the shame flute. Devices that may have existed but whose myth became bigger than their actual use. And yet, as you hold one of the replicas in your hands, cool, heavy, impossibly uncomfortably, you realize something. Real or not, it feels medieval, brutal, controlling, and deeply distrustful of the body, which means it fits perfectly into the world you've been exploring, where sin is feared, punished, and always hiding just under the surface of virtue. Whether anyone actually wore one might matter less than the fact that everyone believed someone could. You leave the fortress behind, passing through a courtyard where lovers once danced under banners and suspicion. Your thoughts are filled with iron and fire, with the absurdity of locking up lust and pretending that would be enough to make it disappear. And now you're heading to a wedding not for love, but for duty. And the guests are more interested in the bridal sheets than the bride and groom. You arrive just in time for the wedding feast. It's a blur of roasted meat, sticky wine, laughter thick with the smell of onions, and nobles in velvet, laughing a little too loudly. The bride and groom sit under a canopy of embroidered cloth, looking like two strangers stuck in the world's most awkward team-building exercise. She's pale and stiff, looking down at her hands like she's trying to disappear. He's already 3 glasses of wine in and grinning at something that probably isn't funny. No one here seems to care about love. They're waiting for the real show, the bedding ceremony, yes, the moment when all pretending stops and the new couple is led, often publicly, to their marriage bed. The crowd doesn't even try to be subtle. They're chanting songs, cracking jokes, and making rude rhymes about fruit and animals. If this feels incredibly invasive, it's because it is. But in medieval Europe, this was normal. A marriage wasn't considered valid until it was consummated. And sometimes, the proof wasn't just expected. It was required. You follow the group up narrow stairs, lit by flickering candles, where the newlyweds are left in their room like farm animals in a pen. Onlookers, nobles, clergy, servants, even the bride's aunt gather around the bed as the couple is undressed. There are rules, of course. No touching, just watching, encouraging, and teasing. A few people throw flower petals. One knight plays a lute. It's surreal. The couple climbs under the sheets, and then the curtains are drawn halfway, because the moment they finish, everyone wants to know. You'd think this kind of public display would kill the mood, but that wasn't the point. This ritual wasn't about intimacy, it was about legitimacy. Marriages in the medieval world weren't romantic contracts, they were economic alliances, political moves, or strategies to transfer land and titles. And to make them official, there had to be evidence of consummation. That brings you to the infamous bridal sheet inspection. In many places, after the act was done, or in some cases claimed to be done, the bed linens were displayed, often outside the house, so the blood could prove the bride's virginity. Red spots meant purity, honor, and a good investment. No stains. That was a problem. Rumors could start. Dowries could be returned. Families could fight. In one recorded case, a groom annulled the marriage on the spot and demanded his money back. The bride was 15. Her father sued for slander. The court ruled in favor of the bedsheet, of course. Not every woman bled, and many knew it, so some got clever. There are whispered stories of brides pricking their fingers, slipping animal blood onto the sheet, or bribing servants to confirm what didn't actually happen. One merchant's daughter supposedly kept a small bottle of chicken blood hidden in her corset, just in case. Virginity was such a valuable thing that entire futures depended on the appearance of it, not the reality. And the groom, well, no one cared if he was a virgin. In fact, it was often expected that he wasn't. Men were told to train before marriage, sometimes with prostitutes, to make sure they could perform when it mattered. You find a text from a Spanish doctor, warning young husbands to avoid overexcitement and uncontrolled haste, so the bride wouldn't remain dissatisfied and suspicious. So while she was expected to be untouched, he was expected to be skilled. This was not an equal situation. You come across one particularly strange tradition from Central Europe, where the bride's mother would stay in the room, not to watch the act, but to supervise decency. She'd sit in a corner chair, her eyes, politely, turned away, hands folded, humming to herself, as if that somehow made things better. In other cases, a priest would bless the bed, literally sprinkle it with holy water, and then give instructions to the couple before tiptoeing out. "Be fruitful," he'd whisper, "and remember that Christ is watching. No pressure." Here's your oddball fact of the night. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, if a marriage wasn't consummated within 3 days, it could be legally annulled, and people checked. One story tells of a young noblewoman whose husband was too shy or too uninterested to touch her. On the 4th day, the bishop sent an investigator to the bedroom. When the sheets were clean and the servants were wide-eyed with disappointment, the marriage was dissolved. The husband joined a monastery. The bride remarried a week later to her cousin. Even when there wasn't a formal inspection, rumors were dangerous. A new bride who seemed too cheerful or too sore could become the target of gossip. If she limped, some whispered she'd lost her virginity before the wedding. If she was glowing too much, maybe she enjoyed it too much, which was also suspicious. Either way, people were obsessed with bedroom details that weren't their business. And that's where the debate still continues. How much of this was real, and how much was just a theatrical tradition? Some historians argue that public bedding rituals were more common among the nobility and were mostly symbolic. Others insist they happened in middle-class homes, with neighbors poking their heads in for a look. There's even a theory that some of the stories are later exaggerations, with Renaissance authors mocking the past. But either way, the message was clear. Your body was not just yours. It was property, proof, and a legal turning point. As the room gets quiet and the crowd drifts back to their wine, you peek through the curtain. The bride lies still, eyes open. The groom is snoring. The sheet, folded at the end of the bed, is already being watched by the nursemaid. Whether there's blood on it or not, the judgment will come either way. You slip back downstairs. As the music starts again, your stomach feels uneasy, not from the food, but from the feeling that nothing about this night was truly private. Not the vows, not the bed, not the love, if it existed at all. Next, you're ducking into a church pew to hear what the priests say about all this. Spoiler, they're not happy, and they have a sermon that's about to make you regret your entire body. You slip into the back of the church just as the priest climbs up to the pulpit, his robes swishing like a curtain rising on a one-man morality show. The pews are full. Peasants, merchants, and a few nobles are packed in for the Sunday sermon, and even the air seems heavy, thick with dust, incense, and anxiety. The priest clears his throat, lifts his arms dramatically, and begins the topic. Lust. Again. Always he starts with a warning. The body is a container for temptation, he announces, and lust is its captain, steering us straight into damnation. You lean back, half curious, half afraid of what comes next. Spoiler, it's not going to be subtle. The sermon moves forward like a war drum. Sex outside of marriage is a sin. Sex in marriage without trying to have children is also a sin. Thinking about sex is a sin. Looking at someone with desire is a double sin. You can almost feel the collective tensing of an entire village trying not to remember last night. The church, especially in the later Middle Ages, was on a full-scale mission to control the human body, and it tried hardest in the area of sexuality. You read some of the texts used to guide confessions and sermons, and they're more detailed than any romance novel. They categorized scenes down to the position, the frequency, and even the mood. Did you enjoy it? That's worse. Did you do it for mutual pleasure? That's practically Satanism. And yes, There were official lists. One document from the 13th century lists over 30 unlawful sexual positions, along with their punishments. Some priests told couples that only the missionary position was acceptable. Others believed even that was questionable if there was too much groaning. One preacher famously warned his congregation that even kissing with tongue could summon demons. You look around the church and wonder how anyone managed to have children at all. The priest thunders on, quoting Augustine, the father of Christian guilt, who insisted that the only reason for sex was to have children. And even then, you should feel a little bad about it. According to him and many other medieval theologians, desire was a result of the fall of man. Adam and Eve ruined everything. Lust is not love. Lust is proof that we are broken. If you enjoy sex, it's because sin lives in your body. No amount of praying can scrub that out. You catch the eye of a woman 2 rows up who looks like she's trying not to laugh or cry. It's hard to tell. Maybe she's thinking about the night before, or maybe, like you, she's just tired of the contradiction. Everyone is expected to marry, have kids, and populate the Christian world, but also to pretend that sex is a joyless, guilt-filled duty that must never be enjoyed. It's like being told to bake a cake without tasting the batter or smiling while you do it, and yet the church didn't ignore sex. It obsessed over it. Monks wrote long texts on the dangers of wet dreams, pollution. They called it because, clearly, a spontaneous arousal meant the devil was messing with your dreams. There were entire theological debates about whether married couples could have sex on Sundays, feast days, or during Lent. The answer was usually no, but maybe, if you really, really needed to, and cried afterward. One friar you read about, Brother Peter, bless his heart, argued that even married couples who loved each other too much were guilty of sin if their affection led to pleasure. He warned that too much joy in the marriage bed would soften the heart and weaken the soul. You wonder what his own bed looked like. Probably a plank of wood and a bad attitude. Still, not all churchmen were complete funkylers. A few quietly admitted that desire was natural, even useful, in a marriage. Some theologians wrote that affection between spouses was a gift from God, a way to keep couples together through hard times, but they were in the minority. Most voices doubled down. Lust equals sin. Your body is suspicious. Your thoughts are worse. And don't even think about touching yourself. Here's your quirky fact for the night. In some regions, the church advised that married couples should not have sex for 40 days before Easter, 30 days before Christmas, 7 days before taking communion, and on all feast days, of which there were a lot. By the time you add in menstruation, pregnancy, postpartum periods, and fasting seasons, the average medieval couple was left with about, 5 to 10 guilt-ridden, nervously performed nights per year, max, and don't you dare enjoy them. Meanwhile, the same church that preached against lust in sermons also funded illuminated manuscripts that showed Adam and Eve blushing under fig leaves, demons groping monks in their sleep, and even naked saints resisting temptation while naked. The mixed messages are almost funny if they weren't so damaging. On one hand, sex is dangerous. On the other hand, look at these pictures of people almost having it. And the debate still continues in academic circles. Some argue that medieval Christians truly believed all this, living lives of repression and shame. Others suggest that people just nodded along in church and then went back to doing whatever they were going to do anyway. After all, there's no shortage of confessions, court records, and poetry filled with desire, scandal, and not so holy thoughts. Maybe people learned to live in both worlds, pious by day, passionate by night, back in the church, the priest is finishing up, his voice softening as he calls for everyone to repent. Guard your thoughts, he says, for they are the seeds of action. Even a single lustful glance can be the beginning of eternal damnation. You look around at the crowd again, and it's clear. No one here is completely free of guilt. That's kind of the point. Keep them ashamed, and they'll keep coming back. Keep confessing, keep donating, keep believing. You slip out the side door as the choir begins to sing, their voices echoing off. The stone in serious harmonies. Outside, the sun is high, and the street smells like life. Cooked onions, fresh bread, unwashed bodies, and horses. You take a deep breath. The church may have tried to shame every human urge, but out here, people are still kissing, still loving, still sneaking behind haystacks. Next, you'll follow some of those forbidden glances into darker corners of society, where same-sex love flickered quietly and persistently under the surface of a world that swore it didn't exist. The city narrows around you into quieter corners, alleys, shadowed by tall stone buildings, spaces where eyes are less watchful and whispers travel farther than footsteps. You've left behind the sermons and the public punishments, slipped out of the town square, where sin is loudly condemned, and into a realm of softer defiance. This is where the things no one dares to name still managed to survive. Same-sex love. In the Middle Ages wasn't just forbidden, it was declared impossible. And yet, here you are, walking the same streets where it persisted anyway. Stubborn as ivy growing between cracks in the stone. You pass two young men sitting beside a fountain, their shoulders just barely touching. Their conversation is quiet and casual on the surface, but the way they look at each other says a lot. A look held a moment too long, a smile that's a bit too shy. No one would notice if they weren't looking closely, and that's the secret, isn't it? In a world that insists this love doesn't exist, the key to survival is not being seen, or being seen just enough to pass as something else. The church's official position was simple. Homosexuality was sodomy, and sodomy was a sin so serious. It was ranked just below heresy and witchcraft. Punishments ranged from public penance to mutilation, exile, or execution. But the church also didn't define it clearly. For all the fear they spread, they didn't really understand what they were condemning. Was it desire? Was it an action? Could two people of the same sex love each other without sinning? The lack of clarity created space for contradictions and for survival. Medieval legal records are filled with cases that hint at a hidden world. A monk caught writing passionate letters to a fellow brother. A nun moved to another convent after being too close with another sister. A city official fined for hosting inappropriate entertainments in his private garden. One man was brought before the court in Florence for embracing another in the manner of a lover. The record doesn't say what happened after. It rarely does, but not every story ends in punishment. In some corners of the medieval world, especially in cities like Venice, Florence, and Paris, same-sex desire thrived under layers of denial and clever, indirect language. You come across the word fraternitas, meaning brotherhood, used in records of unusually intense male friendships. Maybe, maybe not, but they offered a safe way to say, "I love you," without drawing too much attention. One of the most remarkable examples you find is the case of John and William, two Englishmen from the 14th century who were arrested for living together as husband and husband. The record is brief, but it's clear they had some form of commitment, shared property, a shared bed, and a shared reputation. The authorities didn't quite know what to do with them. They were fined, released, and mostly left alone. An exception, not the rule, but a small ray of light nonetheless. And then there's the poetry. So much of it hiding in plain sight. You find a Latin poem written by a monk to his beloved, filled with a longing that's too tender to be anything but romantic. When I see you, my heart is restless, he writes. When you leave, my soul retreats into silence. It's possible to read it as spiritual longing, but the way he describes the other man's mouth, his hands, his scent. A sister named Agnes wrote dozens of letters to a fellow nun, Beatrice. She called her my mirror, my delight, and the only place my soul finds rest. Their letters survived only because someone, likely a less sympathetic superior, copied them into a book of dangerous attachments, which ironically preserved their story. And here's a quirky detail for the night. In 14th century France, some men in same-sex relationships took part in mock weddings, complete with rings, vows, and even bride prices. These events were done in secret, often during festivals or carnivals, where rules were more relaxed. Of course, if they were caught, they were condemned as blasphemers. But for that one night, they got to pretend. Even within the church, things weren't as black and white as the preachers claimed. As long as they were expressed through letters or poetry, and not, actually acted upon. The brothers of the common life, for example, encouraged emotional intimacy among male students as a form of spiritual brotherhood. Was that a cover for something more? Possibly, or maybe it was an attempt to create a space where closeness wasn't instantly labeled as a sin. That's the great scholarly debate, of course. Were these intense same-sex friendships truly romantic and erotic? Or are modern readers just projecting their own ideas onto the past? Some historians argue that medieval people had different categories of love, and what looks romantic to us was just emotional closeness. Others say, come on, read the poems. These people were in love. They were just stuck in a society that didn't have the language or freedom to say it out loud. As you wander further, you realize that surviving meant becoming fluent in subtle hints and hidden meanings. Same-sex love didn't announce itself. It slipped between the lines. It lived in coded glances, careful phrasing, and shared spaces that outsiders couldn't understand. In many ways, it was a kind of medieval queerness that foreshadowed everything to come, resilient, adaptive, private, but powerful. And for all the fear and silence, there was beauty, too. You think of two men writing poems to each other by candlelight, their fingers stained with ink and trembling with emotion. Or two women walking side by side in a convent garden, their hands brushing, their voices low and warm. They may have been erased from the spotlight of history, but they existed, they loved, and they found ways to keep that love alive. However briefly, however secretly, you leave the quiet back streets and rejoin the flow of city life. Bells ring in the distance. A market opens. Life goes on, louder now. But you carry that stillness with you. The knowledge that beneath the surface of all the sermons and punishments, there were always people reaching for each other in the dark. Next, you're heading straight into the world of legalized sin. Brothels that paid taxes, courtesans who held court, and city councils that tried to regulate desire like it was just another public service. You follow the smell before you see the street. A mix of rosewater and sweat, incense, and something muskier. It leads you to a narrow alley behind the marketplace, where laughter spills out of open windows and silk curtains flutter like flirty glances. This isn't a hidden den of sin, quite the opposite. You've stepped into the red light district, medieval style, a neighborhood designed not to hide lust, but to manage it. Welcome to the world of approved sin, where brothels were legal, regulated, and in some places, funded by the city itself. It's not the lawless, secretive place you might expect. Brothels in the later Middle Ages were often clean, orderly, and, strangely, official. The women wore specific clothing, often red hoods or belts, to identify their job. The buildings were licensed by the city, inspected by officials, and sometimes owned by the city itself. In places like Vienna, Paris, and London, city councils taxed the brothels and used the money to fund public projects. You heard that right. Medieval Europe paved roads and built fountains with sex money. You wander through a brothel courtyard in southern France. They spot you immediately. New face, curious eyes, bad at pretending you're here for business. One of them, a sharp-witted woman with reddish-brown hair and a knowing smile, waves you over. You get the sense she said that to more priests than tourists. Her name is Aveline. She's not just a worker. She's the unofficial boss, the madam. She deals with the tax collector, screens potential clients, and makes sure the women under her roof are paid and fed. No pimps, no thugs, just a system of control. Pleasure designed as much for public safety as for personal enjoyment. And this isn't just tolerated, it's encouraged. The church's view on prostitution was, in its own way, disturbingly practical. St. Augustine had claimed that without prostitution, lust would cause chaos. So it was better to contain it, they thought, like a fire kept in a fireplace. The brothel became a pressure valve, a place for unmarried men to release temptation without corrupting good women. In Florence, there was even a city-funded brothel called the Casa del Dun, where sex workers received meals, medical care, and police protection in exchange for regular reports on their clients' behavior. Of course, the reality wasn't so clean. While some women found independence and community in this system, others were forced into it by poverty, threats, or family desperation. Girls, as young as 12, were put to work as servants, only to be trained for the profession. Some were kidnapped. Others were sold by their parents. Once inside, it wasn't easy to leave, especially if you had debts, a child, or nowhere else to go. The line between sex work and slavery was often paper-thin, and sometimes not even that. Aveline, your sharp-edged guide, tells you this much without flinching. Some of us chose this, others didn't. Either way, it's work. Her voice is steady, not bitter, just accepting. Men come in looking for pleasure. We sell it like bread and wine. Doesn't mean we're empty. You look at the other women laughing, playing cards. They're not just objects. They're people, surviving in a system that both punishes and profits from their bodies. And here's where it gets weird. In some towns, brothels were located right next to churches, literally side by side. You read about one Parisian priest who complained that the moaning from next door made it impossible to preach during evening mass. In another case, a bishop blessed a brothel after it reopened under new management, saying it was important for moral containment. You're not sure if that's hypocrisy or just medieval efficiency. Also, here's your quirky fact for the night. In London's Southwark district, sex workers used a kind of early branding. They wore specific color-coded dresses based on their specialty, and their services were advertised with symbols like a peacock feather in the window or a boot tied to the door handle. You imagine what Yelp reviews would look like in 1387, and try not to laugh. Of course, being regulated didn't mean being protected. When the plague swept through cities, prostitutes were often the first to be blamed. Some were kicked out, others were whipped publicly to cleanse the city. And while many clients came from the upper classes, the women faced all the consequences if they were caught. One girl in Avignon was executed for spreading syphilis, even though her most regular customer was a cardinal. Still, the system survived because it was useful. Brothels served a political purpose. They kept excess desire off the streets. They gave soldiers, merchants, and clergy a discreet place to go. And perhaps most importantly, they were visible and manageable. If lust could be taxed and scheduled, maybe it wouldn't spill over into the homes of respectable citizens. Scholars are still debating how much power medieval sex workers really had. Some argue that the brothel system was completely exploitative, a machine of control and shame. Others see moments of independence, women who rose to positions of power, ran their own businesses, or even retired with wealth and property. There are records of former prostitutes becoming respected landowners, midwives, and even nuns. One particularly bold woman in Flanders sued a nobleman for breaking a contract and won back in the brothel. Aveline shrugs off a question about retirement. Maybe one day I'll open a bakery, she says. Something sweet, something quiet. But for now, she's in charge here. And in a world that tries to own and silence women like her, that's no small thing. As you leave the district, the sound of music and laughter fades behind you. It's getting dark, but the lamps are lit. Life goes on. Desire doesn't disappear just because it's labeled dangerous. Sometimes it just finds a price tag and a time slot next. You'll meet the women who refuse to be priced, categorized, or silenced. Widows, rebels, mistresses, and those who decided they wanted more than society ever planned to give them. You find yourself in a quieter part of the city, in a small workshop where sunlight streams through a high window, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the air. This isn't a brothel or a nunnery. It's the home of a woman named Marjorie, a widow who runs her own weaving business. She's not waiting for a new husband, and she's not praying for salvation. She's just living, and in this world, that's a radical act. A husband is a master, she says, her hands moving expertly over the loom. A convent is a prison. I prefer my own company. Marjorie represents a group of medieval women who are often forgotten, the ones who didn't fit into the neat boxes society created for them. They were widows who chose not to remarry, single women who ran businesses, and mistresses who wielded a quiet kind of power. They existed in the gray areas, and that's where they found their freedom. Take widows, for example. In many parts of Europe, a widow could inherit her husband's property and run his business. This gave her a level of independence most women never had. She could make contracts, sue in court, and decide her own future. Of course, there was pressure to remarry, to put a man back in charge. But many, like Marjorie, resisted. They enjoyed their autonomy. They hired their own workers, managed their own money, and sometimes took lovers on their own terms. One story tells of a wealthy widow in London who had affairs with 3 different men at the same time. A young clerk for his mind, a knight for his body, and a merchant for his money. She never remarried. She died rich and, by all accounts, very satisfied. Then you meet Joan, a silk dyer, who shares a home with another woman, a baker named Anne. It's a practical arrangement. Joan's workshop is in the back. Anne's ovens are in the front. But you notice the small things, the way they finish each other's sentences, the shared cup of wine at the end of the day, the fact that Anne's nephew isn't actually her nephew. He might not even be her cousin. The 2 women share a home, a bed, and a business. And while they never say out loud what they are to each other, the answer hangs in the space between their words. They live in that blurry zone where the village isn't quite sure what's going on, but no one dares to ask. Joan smirks when you bring it up. I dye silk, she says. I don't explain myself. In a world where women were supposed to marry or go to a convent, she's chosen a third option, self-sufficiency. And then there are the mistresses, often painted as sinful distractions or scandalous shadows in noble courts. They were far more complex than their reputation suggests. Where a well-dressed woman named Isolde greets you in a garden that smells of lavender and cloves, she's the long-time mistress of a wealthy baron. No secret, no shame. Isolde isn't a scorned woman. She's an institution. His wife manages the estate, she tells you, and I manage him. She chuckles, but there's truth in it. While noble marriages were often political, mistresses offered emotional intimacy, sensuality, and companionship, things that didn't always come with arranged unions. Some had real power. Agnes Sorel, mistress of King Charles VII of France, had political influence and a say in court affairs. She also wore low-cut gowns that scandalized the church and set fashion trends across Europe. A mistress could shape culture and policy from a silk-draped room just as effectively as a queen with a crown. But mistresses walked a fine line. Their power was always fragile, tied to the whims of the men who kept them. If their patron died, remarried, or lost interest, they could be cast out overnight. They were richer than some, sure, but legally vulnerable. Many secured gifts of land or property, hoping to protect their futures before their lovers moved on. Some succeeded, others vanished from the records, unnamed and unsupported. You also meet a few women who operated completely outside the formal systems, true rebels. One is a healer named Tilda, who lives in a hut on the edge of the woods. She's not a witch, though plenty of people call her that. She grows herbs, treats wounds, and knows more about the human body than most city doctors. She's had lovers, she admits, both male and female, but doesn't keep them long. Too noisy, she says, rinsing roots in a copper bowl. I like silence better. Her independence comes at a cost, constant suspicion. The church doesn't like women with knowledge. The men in town don't like a woman who doesn't need them. Tilda shrugs. Let them talk. And talk they do. The medieval world ran on gossip, and nothing got tongues wagging faster than a woman who refused to stay in her place, a widow who didn't remarry. These women were either accused of sorcery, seduction, or more subtly, of just being strange. You read case after case of women called to testify, not for crimes, but for behavior unbecoming a woman. Sometimes that meant swearing. Other times it meant walking alone after dark. One particularly memorable case involved a woman in Lübeck who wore trousers under her dress and was brought before the council for masculine arrogance. Her defense: it's warmer. In a few regions, especially in late medieval Germany, women's guilds allowed single or widowed women to join as full members and even vote on business decisions. In one town, a female-led brewing guild dominated the local beer market for decades. They brewed, they profited, they enforced quality standards with a kind of delightful fierceness. If the men complained, the women raised the prices. These stories challenge the tired idea that medieval women were all quiet, silent, or stuck in marriage. They weren't. Many were loud, resourceful, and strategic. They moved through systems that were meant to limit them and found cracks to slip through. Some, like Joan, Tilda, and Marjorie, simply stepped aside and built new paths entirely. But scholars still debate just how free these women really were. Some argue their independence was always on a knife's edge, easily taken away if they stepped too far out of line. Others point to evidence of lasting influence. Women who left wills, ran estates, and wrote letters that reshaped family fortunes. You can almost hear the tension in the historical sources. Were these women exceptions, or proof that the rules were never as strict as they seemed? As you leave Marjorie's cottage, the street glows in the early evening light. A girl passes by, carrying a bundle of herbs. A merchant's wife barks orders at a servant. Two older women sit on a stoop, gossiping about a neighbor who smiles too easily. Life continues, full of contradictions. Women in the Middle Ages were saints, sinners, wives, widows, mothers, witches, rulers, rebels. People warm. Because when everyone says desire is sinful, even clothing becomes part of the game. You run your fingers along a bolt of fabric draped across a merchant's table. Deep crimson velvet, smooth as sin. Even in the noisy market, with its clanging bells and shouting vendors, this cloth seems to hum with a silent suggestion. It was seduction, armor, and manipulation, sometimes all at once. It whispered things that no one dared to say out loud. Because when the church preached modesty and self-control, people did what they always do. They got creative. The merchant waves you over, eager to show off his imported goods. Lapis lazuli, and as thin as a breath, it catches the light, shimmering and slipping over his hands like water. For noble ladies, he says, but you can tell it's not meant to cover much. In the upper classes, layers of gauze and silk weren't just luxuries. They were strategic distractions. The curve of a wrist, a hem that lifted a little too high when walking. Skin was always just a flicker away. Sumptuary laws, those fancy words for clothing restrictions, were supposed to stop this. They were issued by both the church and the government, and they dictated who could wear what. Commoners couldn't wear velvet. Prostitutes had to wear specific colors. No woman could wear pearls unless her husband earned a certain amount of money. And no one, not even queens, was supposed to show too much skin. Naturally, everyone ignored these laws, or found clever ways around them. You see a woman passing by in a gown that hugs her hips a little too closely, the lacing on her back deliberately tight. Her head is covered, yes, because of modesty, but her hair peeks out in golden curls from under her veil. That's on purpose. In fact, hair itself was considered extremely erotic. Theologians wrote long texts about it. St. Paul said women should keep it covered so they don't tempt men into sin. But behind closed doors, hair was let down, brushed, scented, and shown to lovers like a personal striptease. Then there are the shoes. Oh, the shoes. In the late Middle Ages, men wore poulaines, long, pointed shoes that stretched several inches past the toes, curving up like a wink. The church hated them. They called them prideful, sinful, and obscene. Why? Because the longer your shoes, the richer, and therefore more sexually suspicious you seemed. You try not to laugh, but the logic is delightfully absurd. Women had their own tricks, fitted bodices. Even the smell of clothing mattered. Clothes were often scented with herbs, like rose, lavender, and frankincense-scented signals that said, "I'm clean, I'm wealthy," or sometimes, "I'm ready." There were no Chanel counters, but the effect was the same. Smell, texture, colorage was a code. The church, of course, panicked over and over. Of the devil. One preacher warned that silk clung to the body like Satan to a soul. Another said fur-lined sleeves were like velvet paths to hell. You wonder if he ever touched one. And here's a quirky fact for the night. Some medieval men wore codpieces, little fabric pouches at the front of their pants. Not just for protection, but to exaggerate what they had. Early on, they were functional. But by the 15th century, they had become bigger and more decorated, padded, stuffed, and embroidered. Some were shaped like animal heads or held open like flower petals. One even had a tiny dagger sewn onto it for no clear reason except maybe overcompensation. The codpiece became such a symbol of masculinity that scholars today still debate whether it was more about sex or status, or both. A knight in a well-fitted suit with an oversized codpiece wasn't just saying, "I'm a warrior." he was also saying, I have heirs, and possibly I have syphilis, since some were designed to hold medicated cloths for infected men. But let's not ruin the fantasy just yet. Meanwhile, in courtly circles, fashion turned into foreplay. Lovers would give each other clothing tokens, a glove, a ribbon, a sleeve. These weren't just sentimental, they were invitations. A ribbon worn on the arm signaled devotion. A dropped handkerchief could start a scandal. You read one love poem where a man spends 10 lines describing the texture of a woman's stocking before ever mentioning her face. Clothes made the body, both visible and hidden at the same time, a game of suggestion and denial. Not all messages were private. In some places, clothing became political. During the 100 Years' War, English women were forbidden from wearing French styles, a subtle way of connecting loyalty with morality. To wear the wrong cut of fabric was considered almost treasonous, as if lace could betray a kingdom. You find yourself staring at a gown in a tailor's shop. It's green velvet, laced up the front, with slits at the sleeves that let the linen underdress puff out like clouds. See a noblewoman wearing this at court, carefully not spilling her wine, smiling just enough at her rival's husband. She knows what she's doing. Fashion in this world is not silly. It's a strategy. It's a language. And yet, the rules still hung heavy. A woman who dressed too finely could be called vain. A man who wore soft fabrics could be mocked as effeminate. Gender norms were stitched into clothing, just like the embroidery. One record from London shows a man arrested for wearing a woman's cloak and acting coy. It was about keeping everyone in their place. Scholars still argue over whether these fashions liberated people or constrained them. Did they let people express secret desires through symbols? Or did they just wrap lust in another layer of social rules? Like so much in the Middle Ages, the answer is in the tension. People wanted to feel beautiful, wanted to be desired, and when words failed, fabric spoke for them as you leave the market. The wind lifts the edge of your cloak, and a passing man glances. His look is too long, too bold. You ignore it, but the message is clear. You're part of the game now. Dressed or undressed, you carry the story of your body wherever you go next. Creatures, medieval people, blamed for everything that happened in the dark. The night falls heavier here, darker than any you've known on this journey so far. You're no longer in the courtly gardens or the busy brothel alleys. Now you walk through a village smothered in silence. Shutters are bolted tight and candles are put out early. Even the dogs are quiet. The fear here isn't of thieves or sickness. It's of what visits in the night. You're entering the world of medieval demons, where desire and dread twist together in feverish dreams, and where succubi and incubi wait just beyond the reach of the candlelight dot. You hear about it first from a shepherd who crosses himself 3 times before he speaks. She said it came through the wall, he mutters. Took her in her sleep, looked like her husband, but with burning eyes. The woman he's talking about hasn't left her bed in days. She won't speak, just stares. The priest says she's been touched by the devil. The midwife whispers that she's had a visitation. No one says what they really think, that she had a dream so vivid it shook her body and her soul. In the medieval mind, lust that arrived uninvited and was hard to explain, especially in dreams, or that state between sleep and being awake, had to come from outside. It couldn't be from the self. It had to be a demon. And so the incubus and the succubus were born. They were shape-shifting spirits who slipped into your bed when your defenses were down. The incubus, a male demon, assaulted women. The succubus, a female demon, preyed on men. Though, to be honest, the rules got fuzzy pretty fast. Some demons apparently didn't care about gender. Some switched forms. Some took on the shapes of lost lovers or dead spouses, easing their way into dreams with familiarity, and then taking what they wanted. You flip through a dusty copy of the Malleus Maleficarum, that charming 15th century witch-hunting manual, and find entire chapters dedicated to demonic lust. The authors, two fanatical inquisitors, claimed that demons collected semen from sleeping men and used it to impregnate women. Stealing seed became their explanation for pregnancies with no known father, wet dreams, and even homosexual encounters. In their minds, it was a logical system of infernal reproduction, totally scientific, completely insane. But the fear was real. People believed their dreams were not private. If you woke up, flushed, panting, or with signs of arousal, you could be accused of inviting demonic activity, even if you swore you were asleep. For women, especially, it was a trap. Admitting to arousal was dangerous, but denying it, if someone else suspected you, could also lead to punishment. In some convents, nuns reported visions of devils with warm breath and fingers like fire. Others claimed to see beautiful men who whispered Latin and kissed their necks as they recited psalms. You think about how lonely those convents must have been, and how easy it is for suppressed longing to wear the mask of a nightmare. Not everyone feared the demons, though. Some tales read suspiciously like fan fiction. One woman in Milan was put on trial for claiming she willingly slept with a demon who appeared as a dark-haired knight. She described the encounter in scandalous detail: his eyes, his voice, the way he moved like smoke. The court condemned her as a heretic, of course. But you can't help wondering if she'd just found a clever, dangerous way to talk about her desires. If society gives you no safe language for wanting, you borrow the devil's. The church naturally focused on the horror. Preachers gave long, terrifying sermons about lustful spirits that waited for the careless. They warned that masturbation summoned succubi, that dreams of sex opened your soul to possession, and that pleasure without a purpose was a doorway to damnation. They described demonic lovers who left claw marks, sucked the life from you, made your limbs heavy, and your mind foggy. You read one priest's account of a nun who bled from the thighs and confessed to being ravished nightly. He doesn't ask if she was sick or lonely. He calls her marked by hell. But here's the quirky twist. Some medical writers didn't blame demons at all. They thought it was just bad digestion. Yes, really. In certain medical texts, particularly from the Islamic world and later translated into Latin, wet dreams and erotic dreams were said to be caused by vapors rising from the stomach to the brain. The solution: better food, fewer onions, and maybe a laxative, which, honestly, is kind of refreshing. The open, scholarly debate, though, is about what all this meant for society. Were demon lovers just metaphors for sexual repression? Were they a scapegoat for trauma, desire, or consensual acts that became scandalous? Some argue they were a cultural way to cope, a way to make sense of a body that betrayed you in your sleep, or emotions that were too strong to name. Others believe that these visions and visitations were, at least in part, stories told to satisfy both the confessor and the confessor's audience, whether that was a priest, a judge, or a crowd. Hungry for juicy details, you climb a narrow staircase into the attic of a forgotten priory and find a manuscript filled with scribbled prayers. In the margin, a monk has drawn what looks like a woman with wings kneeling on a man's chest. Above her is a Latin phrase, Domina Somniorum, Lady of Dreams. You stare at it longer than you mean to. The lines are shaky but deliberate, tender. Even it doesn't look like a warning. It looks like longing, and that's what stays with you as you walk back down into the cool air outside. The sense that, for all the fear, there was fascination, that the line between fear and fantasy was thin and easily crossed. In a world that declared desire to be monstrous, people didn't stop wanting. They just gave their hunger horns and wings, and said it came in the night. You turn onto a road leading away from the village, past a shrine where someone has left a candle burning low. The night is quiet, but you wonder who will dream of whom before morning, and what they'll say about it when the sun comes up next. You'll flip through pages of early medical guides and anatomy texts, because, when it came to sex, the experts had ideas, some brilliant, some ridiculous, all deeply medieval. You find yourself in a cramped stone room that smells like dried herbs, burnt paper, and a hint of something sour, possibly regret. A huge book lies open on the table in front of you, its pages smudged with ink and oily fingerprints. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where sex and science shared a very awkward bed. The doctors of the time weren't just trying to cure the plague or diagnose fevers. They were also deeply interested in figuring out what your private parts were up to, and why they wouldn't behave. You start reading one of the most famous texts of the time on the secrets of women. The title sounds mysterious and kind of poetic, until you realize it's mostly a weird mix of anatomy, theology, astrology, and total nonsense. According to this text, a woman could only get pregnant if she had an orgasm. Yes, medieval medical wisdom said that female pleasure was not only natural, it was necessary, which honestly sounds progressive, until you remember that it meant that a pregnancy was proof of female desire. So if a woman claimed she was raped, the fact that she got pregnant was seen as evidence that she must have enjoyed it. A nightmare of logic. This belief came from a mix of ancient sources, like Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through a fog of bad translations and Christian paranoia. Galen, for example, believed that male and female bodies were basically the same, except that women were turned inside out. Testicles became ovaries, the penis became the vagina. It was all a matter of heat and moisture. Men were hotter and drier, so they were superior. Women were cold and wet, so they were unstable, emotional, and frankly, a bit leaky. You flip to an anatomical drawing of a woman, and it's mostly guesswork. No nerves, no clear reproductive system, just a kind of mysterious hollow tunnel leading to a vaguely defined womb shaped like a wine flask. Next to it, a caption reads, "The uterus has 7 chambers, 3 for boys, 3 for girls, and 1 for monsters." You blink, monsters. Yes, apparently, the 7th chamber could produce changelings, freaks, or demons, depending on the alignment of the stars and how much garlic the mother had eaten. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. Still, there was a logic to their madness. Medieval doctors believed in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These controlled everything from your personality to your sex life. Too much blood meant you were lustful and impulsive. Too much black bile meant you were sad and probably celibate. They believed sexual desire was caused by too much heat. That's why women were often considered more sexual than men. They were thought to store more internal moisture, which built up pressure and needed to be released. So yes, in some texts, female masturbation was actually recommended as a form of treatment. Better to spill than to swell, wrote one medical friar. And if that isn't the tagline for an herbal supplement, it should be. But while the theory suggested women had stronger sexual appetites, socially, this was a ticking time bomb. A woman who was too lusty was seen as dangerous and unnatural. There were endless debates about how to control female desire: cold baths, chastity belts, heavy diets of lentils and vinegar. One guide recommended wearing rough, woolen clothes to discourage the senses. Another suggested keeping women busy with embroidery to avoid idle and wandering thoughts. You picture a nun stitching flowers into linen while thinking about the monk who smiled at her yesterday, and you wonder how effective that really was. Men didn't have it much easier. While male sexuality was accepted and even encouraged, especially for having heirs, there was still a lot of panic about when and how it was expressed. Wet dreams were a big concern. Pollution, they called it. Some doctors believed it weakened the heart and clouded the mind. Others warned that it opened the body to demonic invasion. One poor student in Paris supposedly confessed to ejaculating in his sleep 3 times a week and was told to fast, pray, and sleep on hard boards until the devil left his body. You find a particularly bizarre passage in a doctor's notebook explaining how to tell if a woman was a virgin. According to him, you should examine her urine, watch her walk, and see if she laughs too easily. Virgins, he wrote, walk upright, laugh modestly, and keep their eyes down. If she looks you in the eye, she's probably not a virgin. If she laughs loudly, she's definitely not. If she limps, who knows? And here's your quirky fact of the night. Some medieval sex manuals included recipes for aphrodisiacs with ingredients like roasted ants, powdered vulture liver, and wine mixed with goat testicles. One particularly strong potion claimed to inflame the loins and soften the heart. The side effects were probably death, but they never mentioned that part. Other advice included rubbing nettle oil on your thighs, or sleeping with an apple under your pillow and eating it in the morning to absorb the dreams of love. Despite the absurdities, not all of it was fantasy. Some early texts recognized the clitoris, though they often misunderstood it. There were diagrams, however basic, that acknowledged female pleasure. Midwives, who were more grounded than the male doctors, kept oral knowledge about birth, menstruation, and reproductive health that actually worked. It's just that their wisdom rarely got written down, unless a man overheard it and claimed it as his own. Scholars today argue over how seriously these manuals were taken. Some say they were academic exercises, more philosophical than practical. Others believe they were used like early health guides, read in monasteries, passed around university libraries, and consulted by midwives and apothecaries. What's certain is that they reflect a culture that was obsessed with regulating sex, understanding sex, and completely failing at both. As you close the book, your head is swimming with images, ink-stained fingers, misunderstood anatomy, and priests scribbling about lust with the intensity of poets. It's clear that even the experts weren't immune to curiosity, arousal, or confusion. And when knowledge fell short, they filled the gaps with myth, metaphor, and just enough Latin to make it sound official. You step out into the daylight, blinking. Somewhere nearby, a couple is arguing over a bundle of herbs. A midwife scolds a child for throwing a turnip. Life goes on. The human body, with all its mystery and madness, keeps doing what it does. And next, you'll follow it far from home onto ships and dusty roads, where holy men forget their vows and pilgrims stumble into temptation in foreign lands. You wake to the creak of wagon wheels and the low chant of a pilgrim's hymn echoing on the dusty road. The sun is already harsh, the horizon shimmering in the heat as you join a stream of travelers making their way towards something sacred, or at least officially sacred. This is a crusade route, a pilgrimage path, a ribbon of devout feet and tired bodies stretching from Europe to the Holy Land, or towards Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome. And while everyone here claims they're walking for their souls, the reality, of course, is much messier. You're about to learn that piety and libido are much better travel companions than anyone wants to admit. You first fall in step beside a monk with a brown robe, smooth-worn sandals, and eyes fixed on the path ahead. He tells you he's taken vows, poverty, obedience, and chastity. But his voice cracks a bit on that last one. "It's different out here," he mumbles, looking away. On the road. You've heard that before. Pilgrimage, with all its spiritual meaning, also brought anonymity. New towns, no relatives watching, and in many cases, no real supervision. This meant that people who left home to purify themselves often found themselves deep in the very sins they claimed to be running from. In one roadside tavern, you see a knight drinking heavily, bragging that he's taking the cross, but his hand is firmly planted on a barmaid's thigh. Nearby, two supposed pilgrims play dice for a girl's scarf, which was possibly stolen and definitely scented. These travelers aren't all holy. Many are bored, some are broke. More than a few are looking for redemption in the same place. They're also looking for physical pleasure. A surprising number find both in the same bed. This isn't a rare thing. Towns along pilgrimage routes had entire economies built around taking care of pilgrims' bodies, not just feeding and housing them, but offering companionship of a less than holy kind. Temporary brothels popped up like mushrooms along the trail. Some were disguised as bathhouses, others didn't bother pretending. And in Jerusalem itself, crusaders were famously accompanied by a group of camp followers, many of them sex workers, who marched just behind the banners of the cross. In fact, when King Richard the Lionheart led his crusade to the Holy Land, he didn't just bring knights. He brought women, a lot of women. Some were noble companions, others were washerwomen, the preferred nice term for traveling lovers, whether paid or not. Church leaders complained, of course, but nothing much changed. Crusades were months, even years long. Men wanted release. Women wanted protection, food, or sometimes just the chance to escape their pasts. Sex wasn't the exception on these journeys. It was routine. You flip through a soldier's diary, carefully saved in a German abbey, and find an entry that reads, "We prayed at the tomb of Christ, and after, I lay with a girl from Acre. She smiled, as if I had blessed her." It's not regret, it's a memory, and it tells you everything. The holy mixed with the profane so completely that sometimes even the pilgrims couldn't tell the difference. And it wasn't just straight-laced knights falling into temptation. Monks and priests traveled to end. Many saw pilgrimage as a loophole. Far from their bishops, their abbots, and their parishioners, they could sin quietly and return repentant. One friar from Avignon was known to travel with a cousin who mysteriously looked like a young novice in a borrowed dress. They switched roles in different towns. He heard confessions. She caused them. And here's a fringe fact you'll wish wasn't true. In some cases, brothels along pilgrimage routes operated with church protection. In exchange for regular donations or strategic silence, certain religious orders looked the other way. A few even collected penance fees from pilgrims who confessed to visiting these places, then turned around and collected taxes from the businesses themselves. That's medieval capitalism at its finest. But it wasn't always a transaction. On the road, emotions ran high. You meet a woman named Beatrice, a weaver from Valencia, who claims she fell in love with a Breton pilgrim somewhere outside Genoa. He said he'd write. She shrugs, but letters don't walk. She doesn't seem angry, just a little sad. Her voice catches when she says his name. Love bloomed between mud and prayer, and sometimes it lasted only a few nights. Sometimes that's all it was meant to be. Still, for women, pilgrimage was a mixed blessing. Traveling alone could make them seem suspicious, vulnerable, or worse, available. One group of German nuns was famously attacked on their way to Rome by a band of fellow pilgrims who turned out to be ex-soldiers with less spiritual goals. Yet, despite the risk, many women still made the journey, sometimes disguised as men, sometimes traveling in groups. They carried relics and fear in equal measure. And then there's the tale of Maria of Brabant, who wrote about her travels in a letter. Copies survived in a convent archive. In it, she described seeing men bathing naked in the Jordan River and feeling the fire of shame and curiosity at the same time. She never touched anyone, but her words burn with desire. She ends the letter. I did not sin, but I was not holy either. You wish you could have met her. Of course, not everyone returned home unchanged. Some brought back relics. Others brought back children. More than one noble family quietly raised a pilgrim's son, whose father's name was never written down. A few of these children were claimed openly. More were passed off as nephews, wards, or miracles. The road left marks that couldn't be confessed away. Scholars today argue whether these journeys were spiritual tests or excuses to have fun. The truth lies in the middle, as always. For every devout pilgrim crawling barefoot toward a shrine, there was another stopping off at an inn, buying a drink, and finding comfort in the arms of someone who understood what it meant to be far from home. As the sun sets on the winding road, the songs of travelers rise in a messy chorus. Some sing of saints, others of lovers. You see a monk with a woman at his side, their fingers brushing, a quiet story forming between them. And you know, the journey isn't just about reaching a shrine. It's about everything that happens along the way. Next, you'll take a bite of forbidden fruit, herbs, elixirs, and magical potions said to stir desire, bend wills, or cure a broken heart, love potions, aphrodisiacs, and the dangerous art of making someone want you. You open the door to an apothecary shop and immediately feel like you've stepped into a sorcerer's pantry. The smells are overwhelming, a strong mix of lavender, moldy rose petals, bitter wormwood, and something vaguely animal-like. Glass jars line every shelf, filled with pickled roots, dried mushrooms, crushed beetles, and powders in shades you're not sure nature intended. In the back, a woman with ink-stained fingers is hunched over a mortar and pestle, grinding something that smells like rotting oranges and cloves. She says, to cure or to cause. Welcome to the world of medieval aphrodisiacs and love potions, where desire could be coaxed from a bottle, attraction could be stirred into a drink, and heartbreak could be cured with just the right powder tucked into a lover's wine. In a time when talking openly about sex was dangerous, people turned to plants, superstition. Yarrow tied with a red thread. Boil this, she says, and have him drink it before dusk. If his eyes stay on your lips afterward, it worked. Another shelf holds crushed cantharides, or Spanish fly, made from dried and powdered blister beetles. It was said to cause genital swelling and a feverish need for release or death, given by cautious wives to pious husbands, or by nervous nuns to themselves. Nearby, a small vial marked with a crude heart shape holds a liquid made from mandrake root. This one is famous. The mandrake, with its vaguely human shape and eerie shriek when pulled from the ground, was said to stoke passion and create an almost mystical hunger. It was also rumored to grow under gallows, fed by the final emissions of hanged men. Not very romantic, and it wasn't all about seduction. Some potions were for revenge. You find one recipe titled to sour a man's blood. The ingredients: mustard seed, sour wine, dirt from a grave, and fingernail clippings. The belief in it did Still, most of these concoctions weren't evil or malicious, just hopeful. In a world where marriages were arranged, options were limited, and desire was often dangerous, a girl with no dowry might try a love charm to catch a merchant's eye. A young man, too shy to speak, might wear a bag of rosemary and anise sewn into his shirt, praying the scent would give him confidence. Every herb had a meaning, every blend a story. You learn that garlic rubbed on the thighs was thought to bring heat to the loins. Nutmeg, powdered and sprinkled on wine, was believed to loosen tongues and tighten bedsheets. Fennel, when worn in a locket, could repel unwanted attention, which feels like the medieval version of ghosting. Tied them to their ankles and danced under the moon to ensure faithfulness. If it hisses, someone's cheating. But not all love magic was herbal. One common charm involved writing the names of the three Magicaspar, Melchior and Balthazar, a piece of parchment, and hiding it in your lover's shoe. Supposedly, this would make them dream of you and wake up with their heart turned in your direction. Another involved pressing a blessed coin to your tongue and whispering your beloved's name 9 times. If they looked at you before sunset, the spell had worked. And here's your odd fact for the night. In some rural parts of Eastern Europe, villagers believed that semen collected from a linen bedsheet, yes, collected, could be used to create a love ointment when mixed with rose oil and ground bees. The mixture, rubbed on the lips and wrists, supposedly made one irresistible. You try not to gag. All of this, love magic, was considered a form of sorcery. In 1327, one woman was accused of causing a man's unnatural fixation by boiling a love root in goat milk under the new moon. Her punishment was a whipping and exile. They just got quieter. Recipes were passed from mother to daughter, from lover to lover. Hidden in cookbooks between soup instructions or scribbled in the margins of medical texts. Some wore their charms in their hair braids. Others stitched them into the hems of their dresses. Were they actual attempts at chemistry, emotional placebos, or just rituals, little acts of control in a world full of uncertainty? Probably all three. What's certain is that the desire to influence love, to stir lust, to protect or provoke the heart, was as real as any miracle claimed from a saint's shrine. As you leave the apothecary, a girl with a basket slips past you, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear. She looks back just once to see if anyone noticed. You did, and maybe someone else will too. Next, you'll climb the steps of castles and courtrooms to see how marriage and power twisted together. Where monogamy was preached, but political alliances often came with side flings, concubines, and expectations that had little to do with love. You're in the great hall of a stone castle now, under a ceiling so high it seems more concerned with impressing God than with keeping the heat in. Tapestries line the walls, showing scenes of hunts, battles, and noble weddings where no one looks particularly happy. You're watching a marriage that's less about vows and more about assets. Because in medieval Europe, love rarely had anything to do with who stood beside you at the altar. Marriage was a strategy. She's 17 and has just been brought over from a rival barony. Their union was arranged when she was still a child, sealed with a signature and a glass of wine, not whispers in the dark. You can feel the coldness between them even now, despite the fire crackling at their feet. Monogamy was the church's official rule, of course, but that rule was applied unevenly at best. Everyone expected a husband to have mistresses. Everyone expected a wife to look the other way. Faithfulness was a virtue, not a requirement. Remember the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII. Their marriage was a complete disaster, both politically and sexually. He was devout, awkward, and barely interested. They had 2 daughters, no sons, and after years of frosty silence, she had the marriage annulled. Her next husband was Henry II of England. They had 8 children, at least 2 legendary affairs, and enough marital problems to fill a Shakespeare play. Clearly, monogamy was flexible, but while kings and lords had room to stray, women didn't. A wife caught in adultery could lose her title, her land, and even her life. In some regions, an unfaithful noblewoman was imprisoned or forced into a convent. One duchess in Brittany was sewn into a sack and drowned for a rumored affair with a knight. Her lover was whipped lightly, then given a new post in the countryside. Justice, medieval style. Not all powerful women accepted this quietly. You read about a Castilian queen who kept her own lovers and dared anyone to challenge her. One of them, a poet, wrote that she touched him like a lioness and ruled him like a king. But her name was scrubbed from several court records, as if desire itself were something you could erase. It wasn't just the nobility playing this game. Wealthy merchants in cities like Florence and Bruges also arranged marriages for profit. Their wives were expected to be silent, fertile, and dressed appropriately. One record shows a man fining his wife 10 silver coins for wearing green silk without his permission. Another forbade his spouse from singing during supper because it was too joyful for a matron. Meanwhile, the same men kept courtesans on a regular payment and visited brothels under the excuse of business meetings. And here's your quirky fact of the night. In 14th century Italy, there was a custom called cittadismo, where noblemen arranged for their wives to have social companions, younger men, often poets or musicians, who were allowed to escort them to events, flatter them, and even share private moments. Officially, it was all very platonic. Unofficially, well, the husbands weren't exactly checking in every night. Some of these companions ended up in the wives' wills, or in anonymous poetry that never quite disappeared. The church kept trying to step in. Bishops preached that marriage was sacred, and any straying from it would lead to eternal damnation, or worse, scandal. Priests gave sermons on the holiness of the marriage bed, but they rarely called out powerful men. The rules were strict for peasants, enforced for commoners, and optional for anyone with a title. You start to realize that medieval monogamy was more about managing appearances than managing desire. Even the marriage ceremony itself had multiple versions. The church preferred marriages to happen before a priest with witnesses and vows, but plenty of unions were sealed with nothing more than a verbal promise and a roll in the hay. Church law eventually recognized these so-called clandestine marriages if they met certain conditions: mutual consent and consummation. In one famous case, a woman proved her marriage by producing the stained sheets knot from the wedding night, but from a week before, behind a barn. Divorce, in the modern sense, didn't exist. Annulments did, but they were expensive and required a good excuse. Usually consanguinity. It turns out you were cousins. Impotence, or non-consummation. The marriage hadn't been completed. Some couples faked these things to escape unhappy pairings. One man even hired a friend to testify that his wife smelled so bad it prevented intimacy. She claimed he simply didn't know what he was doing. The court ruled in her favor. Polygamy, though officially banned, still made shadow appearances. Kings took concubines. Nobles kept unofficial second wives. In some cases, especially in border regions, or among crusaders far from home, men had temporary wives, women they lived with, had children with, and then abandoned when they returned. The church occasionally tried to legitimize these unions or baptize the children, but mostly they were just swept under the velvet rug of political convenience. Scholars still argue over whether medieval people believed in romantic love within marriage. Some did. You read letters between noble spouses filled with real affection. One knight wrote to his wife, "Your absence wounds me like a blade, and your letters are my only bandage." Sweet, right? But they were the exception, not the rule. Most marriages were work, strategic, public, and controlled. As you leave the hall, the newlyweds are nowhere to be seen. Upstairs, their bedding is probably being watched by chaperones, with wine on their breath and high expectations. Whether they find desire or just duty tonight, no one seems to care. The alliance is made. The land is secured. Details. Next, you'll sneak down into the cellar of lineage, the place where illegitimate children were born, hidden, claimed, or cast aside. Because nothing complicates medieval sex more than a baby born in the wrong bed. The hallway is narrow, and the candles are low. You follow a midwife down a winding back staircase, past the sleeping nobles and polished halls of a manor house that pretends everything is perfectly in order. But below the fancy surface, secrets are growing like mold behind fine tapestries. You step into a room tucked behind the kitchens, where a fire crackles and a woman cries softly into a wool blanket. She has just given birth, and from the looks exchanged between the midwife and the nursemaid, this child won't be celebrated. It wasn't born from a marriage, it wasn't expected, and it's not entirely welcome. Illegitimate children in medieval society lived on the sharp edge of proper behavior. Sometimes they were protected, sometimes punished, but always in a fragile position. Everything depended on who your parents were and how willing they were to admit what happened in the dark. This baby, red-faced and crying, is the daughter of a nobleman and a servant girl. He'll never officially acknowledge her. He already has a legitimate heir upstairs, plump and rosy, and watched by 4 nurses. But he might offer a bag of coins to the mother, a cradle, maybe a place in a convent when she's old enough, or maybe not. Sometimes, the girls were sent away to foster homes, or taken in by nuns, raised as orphans with suspiciously large dowries. Other times, they were left at church doors, with only a note and a whispered prayer. Among peasants, things were both simpler and harsher. A child born outside of marriage meant shame, yes, but it also meant fewer consequences, unless the father refused to take responsibility. Bastardy fines existed in many villages. The man paid a small fee, and the woman performed a public penance, often walking barefoot in church. But even in smaller communities, rumors were powerful. A girl with a child and no husband became unmarriageable. Her options were to beg, work, or hope. A wandering friar took pity on her. In the noble class, illegitimacy was an open secret with complicated rules. Kings had official mistresses with their own households, titles, and children who were raised just a step or two below the legitimate heirs. You read about Charles II of Navarre, who set up his favorite mistress in a tower near the castle and sent his own wife letters filled with polite apologies and no intention of ending the affair. Their children were educated, given land, and sometimes even joined the clergy or married minor nobles. Some of these royal bastards became powerful figures in their own right. William the Conqueror, yes, that William was famously known as William the Bastard before he took England by storm in 1066. His illegitimacy didn't stop him. In fact, he wore the insult-like armor. Others weren't so lucky. Illegitimate sons could be blocked from inheritance, denied titles, or forced into the church whether they wanted to go or not. Women fared even worse. A nobleman's bastard daughter might be married off to a minor knight or sent to a nunnery. If she was exceptionally beautiful, she might follow in her mother's footsteps and become someone else's mistress. But love was rarely part of the deal. Legitimacy shaped futures, and the stain of being born on the wrong side of the sheets could last a lifetime. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 13th century England, there was an actual legal term, filius nullius, used in court to refer to an illegitimate child. It means son of no one. Imagine being called that in front of your neighbors. It wasn't just social, it was legal erasure. Bastards couldn't inherit unless they were formally legitimized by a royal order or a papal blessing. And yes, people paid a lot to get those stats still. Some tried to cheat the system. You come across a forged marriage document with crude handwriting and a fake priest's name. A nobleman used it to claim his mistress had actually been his secret wife, all along making their son legitimate. The trick lasted for 6 months before the real priest showed up and ruined everything. The son was stripped of his inheritance, and the mistress mysteriously died of an illness. You don't ask questions. Sometimes the opposite happened. Lovers got married after the child was born, hoping that a wedding after the fact would clean things up. Church law debated this for centuries. Could a marriage retroactively make children legitimate? The answer changed depending on which pope you asked. Some said yes, others said absolutely not. Scholars still argue whether these shifting rules were acts of mercy, or just a cynical way to control inheritance and keep power in the right hands. But not every story ends in tragedy. You meet a boy named Tomas, born to a merchant and his seamstress, mistress. The father never married the mother, but he paid for Tomas's education and apprenticed him to a scribe. Now grown, Tomas writes contracts for land deals and has the neatest handwriting in the county. He's not nobility. He'll never inherit a manor. But he's respected, clean-clothed, and fully aware of where he came from. My mother gave me her name, he says. My father gave me his coin. That's enough. You realize that for many, survival meant finding power in the margins. Bastards weren't necessarily doomed. They were just uninvited to the party. Some found ways to climb in through a side door. Others built new parties entirely. There's an open, scholarly debate about how much social mobility was really possible for illegitimate children. Were exceptions, like William or Tomas, rare sparks in a dark landscape than we think. Some evidence suggests that, especially in cities, being a bastard lost some of its stigma over time, particularly if the child could be useful, talented, or married off discreetly. Others argue that the stain of illegitimacy clung tight. No matter how well someone did, you leave the manor house quietly, careful not to wake anyone. The nursemaid hums softly to the newborn in the lower room. Upstairs, the nobleman is asleep, beside his lawful wife, dreaming perhaps of neither of them. Somewhere in between, a life has just begun, unwanted in one sense, but not unloved. And that may be the real secret here. For all the laws and shame, hearts still found ways to break the rules. Next, you'll slip into more radical spaces, where heretics preach salvation through sex, couples share each other as property of the divine, and free love means something far older and stranger than Woodstock ever imagined. You've wandered far off the main road now, past the manors and monasteries, beyond the reach of bishops and barons. You're in a clearing surrounded by trees that seem to lean in a little too close, as if they've heard something they shouldn't. Repeat, there's a small gathering around a fire. Men and women, young and old, dressed in simple wool and quiet defiance. One woman sings softly, her voice weaving through the smoke. Another reads from a scroll that isn't recognized by any official. Church. You've found the heretics, the radicals, the ones who dared to mix sex and salvation, and weren't all that sorry about it. Welcome to the fringe movements of medieval Christianity, where rules were loose, desire was spiritual, and nothing was quite what it seemed. You're about to meet people who firmly believed that God lived not in celibacy, but in the body, that the divine could be reached through touch, and that denying pleasure was the real sin. You sit beside a man named Elias, who is broad-shouldered and intense, with fingers stained from copying texts. He tells you he's part of the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a loosely organized and wildly controversial movement that became popular in parts of the Holy Roman Empire and the Low Countries in the 13th and 14th centuries. Their core belief was that once a soul was truly united with God, it rose above sin. This meant that anything they did, anything, was no longer sinful, including sex, especially sex. The Church, predictably, was horrified. The Brethren rejected sacraments, ignored the authority of the clergy, and most shockingly, some of their members claimed to be literally divine. "I am God," one female mystic allegedly said, "and everything I do is holy." You can imagine how well that went over in Rome. But the ideas spread. One woman, Marguerite Porret, wrote a mystical text called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which argued that the soul must surrender completely to divine love, even if that meant abandoning moral law. The Church burned her at the stake in 1310, but her book kept circulating secretly. Scholars still debate whether she practiced sexual mysticism herself, but others certainly did. You hear about sects where members stripped naked during rituals, as both a symbolic and literal act of shedding sin. In some communities, couples shared each other as expressions of divine unity. One heretical group believed that true purity came only after full indulgence, that you had to experience all earthly pleasure before you could be truly free of it. Imagine explaining that to your confessor, and here's your fringe fact for the night. In 14th century Bohemia, a radical sect called the Adamites lived together, rejected clothing entirely, and believed that the naked state of Adam and Eve before the fall was the purest form of existence. They danced, sang, and slept together in the open, claiming they had returned to Eden. The Church sent troops. It did not end well. You listen as a woman named Clara speaks. She's in her 30s, with a crescent-shaped scar on her temple and eyes that watch everything. She talks about love, not just romantic love, but sacred eros. The flesh, she says, is the scroll where God writes. For her, sex isn't just human, it's holy. She describes how, in certain rituals, lovers recite psalms during climax, how prayer becomes a kind of foreplay, and how kissing, when done with intention, becomes a sacrament. Not everyone in the group practices this so openly. Some still struggle with guilt, and yet you sense a quiet conviction among them. They're not rebelling for the thrill. They genuinely believe that desire, when embraced honestly, brings them closer to the divine. Of course, the official church saw this as a threat, not just the theology, but the liberation. If people didn't fear sin, how could you control them? If women claimed sexual independence as a spiritual truth, how could you silence them? And perhaps most terrifying of all, if peasants and wanderers could find salvation without priests or confession, what was left for the church leaders to do? Inquisition records from France and Germany are filled with frantic accounts of these groups. But the line between truth and slander is thin. Did the brethren really engage in orgies, or were they accused of it because they dared to question authority? Were the Adamites dangerous, or just inconveniently naked? Even modern scholars can't agree. Some see these movements as early feminist and egalitarian responses to a repressive church. Others argue they were chaotic, misguided, and sometimes exploitative. You meet a young couple, Mira and John, who have been living with the Free Spirit followers for 2 years. They tell you they used to be married in the official church. There was love. Here, they sleep with other partners, sometimes together, sometimes not. But always with consent, John adds. Always with grace. You can't tell if it's working, but they look content, not ecstatic, not ashamed, just peaceful in their bodies. Still, the risk is real. If they're caught, they could be tortured, executed, and erased. One former member was burned for claiming unity with God through fornication. The word fornication was underlined in red ink, probably by someone with more fear than understanding. You realize how radical it truly is to take something the church labeled shameful and claim it as holy. To say, my pleasure does not condemn me. It connects me to the divine. It's dangerous thinking, transformative thinking, and maybe, just maybe, it's why these groups keep reappearing in history like stubborn wildflowers. You burn them, bury them, and condemn them, but they come back. You leave the clearing under a sky full of stars. Someone sings softly behind you, and the fire crackles like a heartbeat. You're not sure if you believe what they believe, but you understand it. Because, in a world built on control, sometimes the most sacred act is simply wanting without apology. Next, you'll find yourself behind monastery walls and convent doors, where abstinence is the rule. But longing lingers in the silence, and where saints dream of kisses and monks carve their guilt into stone. The village fades behind you as the trees thin, giving way to a small stone chapel and an adjoining cluster of buildings that sit low against the wind. It's peaceful here, with rows of herbs growing beside a crumbling wall and a cow chewing slowly in a field, looking deeply uninterested in your arrival. But beyond the calm, there's something else. A faint tension hangs in the air like smoke. You've come to witness one of medieval history's strangest obsessions, the trials of animals. Here, humans projected their lust, shame, and absurd moral panic onto creatures that couldn't defend themselves. That's right. In the Middle Ages, animals stood trial, real trials, with judges, witnesses, and accusations that usually sounded like fever dreams written down by a monk on a bad mushroom trip. And many of these trials, as absurd as it sounds, were about sex. You step into a small church courtroom where the smell of incense can't quite cover the underlying smell of something more like a barnyard. At the front, a pig sits chained beside an officer, squealing occasionally. The crowd watches grimly. The charge, carnal knowledge of a child. The prosecutor, a local priest, reads the accusation aloud, his voice trembling with a mix of disgust and piety. The audience nods seriously. You want to scream. The pig scratches itself. This wasn't a one-time case. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of animal trials took place across medieval Europe. Pigs, bulls, goats, and even roosters were brought to courtrooms and accused of crimes, often sexual in nature. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was dressed in human clothes, tried for murder and unnatural acts, and then hanged in public. In another case, a donkey was investigated for alleged lewd behavior with a farmer. But plot twist, the donkey was found not guilty because multiple witnesses testified to its modesty and Christian demeanor. Yes, seriously, you sit beside an old scribe who's documenting today's proceedings. He sighs deeply and explains that these trials, while ridiculous now, were deadly serious then. To the medieval mind, animals weren't just beasts. They were part of God's ordered world. If a creature broke that order, it had to be punished. Otherwise, divine justice would fail. In other words, they weren't just punishing the pig. They were restoring cosmic balance, or at least pretending to. But of course, there's more going on here. Beneath the surface of these animal trials is a mess of human emotions, guilt, projection, and repressed desire. In many cases, it seems likely that the animals were scapegoats, convenient targets when the real crimes were too horrifying to face directly. A child found dead, blame the goat. A woman discovered with unexplained injuries, blame the dog. The actual culprits, often neighbors, relatives, or authority figures, went unpunished or unmentioned. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was put on trial for laying an egg, something no rooster should be able to do. The egg was declared the spawn of the devil, and the rooster was burned at the stake. Medieval people believed that a rooster's egg could hatch a basilisk, a monster so deadly its gaze could kill. You can almost imagine the priest scribbling that in his notebook, and then praying for a stiff drink. The church did its part to fuel these fears. Sermons warned that sexual sin could infect the world around you, that even animals might become instruments of corruption. One particularly creative preacher insisted that demons often entered livestock to commit impure acts and tempt the faithful, which somehow meant that your cow's lustful eyes were the devil's doing. The owl was wise. The weasel was a sex maniac. The hedgehog hoarded fruit and sin. Everything had a meaning, usually sexual, and usually terrifying. Scholars have tried to make sense of this medieval madness. Some say it reflects a deep anxiety about control over the body, over the household, and over nature itself. Animals were symbolic stand-ins for urges that couldn't be named out loud. Others argue it was a way of reinforcing power. Holding a trial, even a fake one for a pig, reminded everyone that justice flowed from the top down. The court ruled, the public watched, and order was restored, however ridiculously. But there's a darker side to all this. You come across records of women accused of unnatural acts with animals, usually based on hearsay, jealousy, or suspicion. These women were rarely tried, fairly often tortured, and often executed. Their supposed partners were put down to completing the ritual of shame. In some cases, there's no evidence of a crime at all. Just a woman who lived alone, had too many cats, or refused to marry. You start to see how quickly fear and sexuality can spiral into violence when mixed with superstition. Still, not everyone believed it. In some town records, juries quietly found animals not guilty, or judges delayed trials until they were forgotten. The rats were summoned to court, yes, literally summoned, but didn't show up. The judge, possibly realizing the absurdity of it all, let it go. And yes, this actually happened, with written transcripts. You leave the courtroom shaking your head. Outside, the sky is gray, and a group of children run past, chasing a chicken. The pig is led away, verdict pending. Life continues, bizarre and brutal in equal measure. And you wonder how many of these trials were less about animals and more about our own refusal to face ourselves. Because when people can't deal with their own desires and their own shame, they find something else to punish. A goat, a girl, or you'll find yourself under a death-shrouded sky in a time when the plague tore through every certainty, and lust became both a last act of defiance and a whispered prayer before the coughing began. The coughing starts before you even reach the village. It's dry and distant at first, like the crack of twigs in the wind. But as you get closer, it grows wetter, heavier, like something being torn from inside a body. You step into a town in mourning, though no one has had time to carve that word. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, call it what you like, It doesn't care. You can smell it in the air, sour and hot, like rot just beginning. A cart rolls by, carrying more limbs than it should. Someone throws a rosary after it. Someone else throws ut. And in the middle of it all, you find something unexpected. People still reaching for each other, still touching, still aching to feel alive. Even when death is already in the room. The world is ending, again and again. And medieval people, it turns out, had the same reaction many of us might: panic, prayer, and pleasure. Some turned holy, others turned wild, and many drifted between the two, depending on the hour, the sermon, or who was offering them a drink. You duck into a tavern, one of the few still open, and find it strangely full. The barkeep is coughing into his sleeve, but is still pouring ale. Two men argue about whether the world will end in fire or frogs. A woman is sitting on a man's lap, kissing him between drinks. Everyone here smells faintly of sweat and fear. You sit beside a weaver named Hal, who lost 3 brothers last week and hasn't blinked since Tuesday. "We're all damned," he says. Casually, as if talking about the weather. Might as well have some warmth on the way down. That attitude, surprisingly common, led to a strange surge in erotic behavior during the plague years. People flocked to brothels, not just for sex, but for comfort, for escape, for the illusion that life still had some sweetness left. Others had spontaneous affairs, public displays of desire, and risked the anger of both God and their coughing. Neighbors to feel another body pressed against theirs. Some of it was desperation, some of it was defiance. When you believe the sky is about to fall, rules get fuzzy. Morality becomes optional. One chronicler from Avignon wrote bitterly of men who had never spoken to a prostitute before, now spending their last pennies in her bed, declaring love with every dying breath. He sounded disgusted, but you suspect he was also jealous. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In a few plague-stricken towns, local authorities actually relaxed the rules on sex work during the worst waves of death. They figured if people were going to die, they might as well be distracted. In Paris, some brothels even received temporary protection, considered relief services by desperate city councils. Bodies for hire, one official wrote, to soothe the minds of the terrified. You try not to let the irony swallow you whole. But not everyone welcomed this frenzy of the flesh. The church, as expected, thundered against it. Sermons doubled down. You have to admit, it has a certain poetic ring to it. Flagellant movements rose up in response. These were groups of men who whipped themselves through the streets, begging for forgiveness and driving out desire, one lash at a time. Some of them forbade sex entirely, even between married couples, arguing that abstinence might spare their souls. Others, paradoxically, became so consumed with holiness that they slipped into a kind of ecstatic trance, moaning and writhing in a way that looked suspiciously like something else. Scholars still argue over whether these were spiritual seizures or thinly veiled orgasms. Everything became symbolic. A kiss was defiance. An orgasm was rebellion. Holding someone's hand as the boils rose on your neck wasn't just romance. It was a war against despair. You meet a young woman named Elsa, her cheeks flushed and her eyes hollowed from weeks of bad sleep and bad air. She tells you she slept with the same man who buried her sister. "We didn't mean to," she says, her voice barely a whisper. "We just didn't want to be alone. Not that night. He's dead now." She isn't yet. Bodies were everywhere, after all. In piles, in beds, in fevered dreams. The line between death and desire got twisted fast. Some believed that lust itself spread the plague, especially among the poor. Others believed it was the rich who brought the disease from their travels, their luxuries, and their excess. Nobody really knew. The fleas didn't discriminate, but still, people tried to love, and sometimes they tried to love honestly. You hear of couples who married quickly, without priests, just to have someone's name to say in the dark. One young scribe wrote that he shared his bed with a girl from a rival village for a week during the worst of it. We didn't speak much, he scribbled, but we held each other. That was enough. There's no record of what happened to her, and yet, amidst all this yearning, not all touches were tender. The breakdown of social order also opened the door to exploitation. Desperate women were forced into sex for shelter. Children were abandoned or sold. Brothels turned into death traps. There are accounts of men robbing plague corpses and then returning to their lovers without even washing their hands. The sickness didn't just rot lungs, it rotted consciences. Still, even in this decay, you feel something deeply human holding on. In a makeshift shelter outside the town walls, two people share a thin blanket, their fingers barely brushing, and they aren't even pretending they're clean. They're just choosing to feel something before the lights go out. Scholars today still wrestle with the paradox of plague and passion. Some argue the increased eroticism was a natural response to trauma. Others suggest it was always there, just unmasked by mortality. When everything else is taken, the body remains. And what people did with their bodies during the plague says as much about resilience as it does about fear. As you walk away from the town, the coughing fades behind you. The night is heavy, but the stars are shockingly bright. Somewhere, another cart is being loaded. Somewhere else, a kiss lands on a fevered cheek. Life, stubborn as it is, goes on. Next, you'll step into the final rooms of this world, a place of last confessions and long shadows, where death meets desire in stained glass and tombstone carvings, and lust writes itself into memory even after the lights go out. The cathedral looms ahead like a ship made of shadow and stone, its spires cutting into a sky bruised with twilight. You walk toward it slowly, your boots echoing on worn cobblestones, slick with yesterday's rain. Not just yours, but theirs, the Lord's, the lovers, the outlaws, the sinners, and the saints. You've seen them in beds, in brothels, behind monastery walls, and beneath plague-ridden blankets. Now, you're stepping into the place where they all eventually come to be remembered, or to be forgotten. Inside, the light is dim, caught in colored glass that scatters fragments of saints across the stone floors. The air smells of wax and old prayers, layered thick like dust. You pass rows of wooden pews and an altar dressed in gold. But what draws your eye are the tombs, dozens of them. Stone coffins are stacked along the walls and carved into the floors, each etched with Latin dates and the soft lies of remembrance. Faithful husband, beloved wife, pillar of virtue. You pause at one, a knight in full armor, a woman beside him, both with their hands folded, eyes shut, and lips still parted, slightly. Lovers, cast in stone. And yet, you can't help but wonder, did they even like each other? Death in the Middle Ages was everywhere, and yet, for all its daily presence, it never stopped being dramatic. Their wills, purchased indulgences, and commissioned artwork, and even in death, the question of sex lingered. Who had been with whom? Who had strayed? Who had touched desire too closely and burned for it? Was rigid. Sinners faced damnation. The pure found paradise. But human memory wasn't so tidy, and neither were the gravestones. You run your fingers along one monument that's clearly had its inscription scraped off and rewritten. The new name barely hides the old grooves. Rumor has it the man buried here was excommunicated for keeping 2 wives, one in town and one in the countryside, and neither knew about the other until his funeral. Apparently, they met while placing flowers. Things got ugly. Someone threw a candle. But these aren't just monuments. They're warnings, celebrations, and excuses. The language of virtue was often code, chaste, sometimes meant got caught and repented. Modest could mean kept her secrets well. One widow, buried with a carved lily and the word pudica, meaning pure, was later revealed in court records to have run a high-end brothel out of her wine cellar. You almost admire the symmetry. Everyone dies. As a virgin saint, then there's the art. Death and lust shared the same palette. You trace the lines of a stained glass window showing Mary Magdalene, not kneeling in repentance, but washing Christ's feet with her hair, her face tender and a little too intimate for comfort. Behind her, a bishop scowls, as if he can feel the confusion she causes. For centuries, Magdalene was the church's favorite symbol of fallen womanhood and redemption, a safe place to park all the unease around female sexuality. Want, sanctified, desire, domesticated. On a column nearby, someone long ago carved a tiny pair of intertwined figures, barely noticeable unless you know where to look. Their faces are rough and weathered by time, but their position is unmistakable. You wonder if a bored mason left them there on a dare, or if it was a tribute, maybe even a memory. Because for all the church's lectures and threats, desire still seeped into the very walls, quietly, persistently. You walk into a side chapel and find a display of death masks, faces cast from wax and painted to look like the deceased. Most are serious, a few are smiling. One has lips parted just slightly, her teeth barely showing. It's unsettling. She was a noblewoman, they say, who died in childbirth. But her journals survived, and in them she wrote long passages about a lover she never named. He brought her pressed violets and touched her face like she might vanish. She never mentioned her husband, not once. And here's your fringe fact of the night. Some medieval tombs were designed with trancy sculptures. These were effigies, showing the person as they were in life on top, and beneath it, a rotting corpse. Flesh above, decay below. A reminder that beauty fades, bones endure, and lust, no matter how vivid, ends here, or seems to. But even in death, desire found its echoes. You read about ghost stories, of widows dreaming of long-dead lovers who visit them at night. Spectral hands, brushing thighs, kisses like cold breath. Monks wrote of temptations that lingered in their dreams, voices of old lovers whispering from beyond. Were they hauntings, memories, or guilt? No one could say. Scholars still argue over how medieval people balanced their fear of damnation with the inevitability of desire. Some suggest they lived in constant mental conflict, publicly condemning what they privately craved. Others believe they were more honest than we give them credit for, navigating lust and sin as parts of life, not contradictions, but companions. Either way, the tombstones don't tell the whole story. You leave the cathedral as the bells begin to ring. A funeral procession passes you. Mourners in black, a casket of polished oak, incense trailing behind. Among them walks a woman with her hand clutched tight to a locket. You don't ask what's inside. You already know. Outside, the wind has shifted. You're standing at the edge of a world that once felt eternal but is now quiet, except for your footsteps. You've traced the shape of medieval lust from the giggles behind market stalls to the ritualized silences of the convent, from flagellation to fornication, from passion to plague. You've seen how people touched and were touched, how they confessed, denied, longed, burned, and finally were buried. Next, as the candles flicker low and the story slips into silence, It's time to wind down with a final breath, a soft descent into sleep, where history rests beside you like a lover with secrets yet to tell. The fire is low now, a hush settling in like dust on forgotten parchment. You sit quietly, letting everything you've seen drift through your thoughts. The low laughter in taverns, the whispered prayers behind cloistered doors, the creak of a bed frame that shouldn't be making that sound in a nunnery. The rustle of parchment, scribbled with secrets too tender for the light of day, folding gently into memory. You've walked through a world that both feared and worshipped desire, where sermons warned you away from lust, even as saints dreamed of divine kisses, where rules were written in stone but broken in soft half-light, by candlelight, or beneath the weight of too much wine. You've met noble women who took lovers in silence, monks who wept after pleasure, poets who turned their longing into art, and peasants who held each other close as the plague drew its last breath. You've learned that sin in medieval times wasn't just something done. It was something felt, carried, confessed, and sometimes embraced. Maybe you've come away a little more skeptical of those stained glass halos. Or maybe you've come to understand that the past was never as clean or as cold as textbooks like to pretend. The truth is, desire has always pulsed just beneath the surface, messy, tender, shameful, and sacred. So, as you ease under the covers tonight, remember that history isn't made only on battlefields and in courts, but in bedrooms and back alleys, in love letters and lace hems, in quiet, aching moments that no one thought to write down, but somehow survived anyway. Our low, the story's done, and the past, for now, can rest.